The patient's vital signs were depicted on the medical equipment. The beeping of the pulse indicator was carried throughout the medical office. A young sick guy was lying on a hospital bed, where a breathing mask was attached to his face. This person was a young youth named Fan Xian. The patient was diagnosed with myasthenia gravis. He was a good man, but completely useless. Opening his eyes, he looked around the ward. An elderly nurse was collecting medical instruments in a box and was about to leave the ward. It seemed to the guy that he had already died, so he was also a virgin. Fan Xian was very upset. Besides, contrary to his expectations, there was not a nice nurse next to him, but this elderly woman. He slowly closed his eyes. His life really was a dull piece of feces. Slowly opening his eyes, the guy saw some mercenaries looking like ninjas in front of him. When he opened his eyes completely, he was very surprised. Fan Xian's adult boyfriend was in the body of a baby. What? Wait a minute. Seeing a man in a black blindfold and dark military attire, he was even more surprised. Fan Xian didn't understand what was going on here at all. Even his hair stood on end from the shock. This man with a black blindfold was moving swiftly through the dark night forest like a real warrior. He was followed by a bunch of black-robed mercenaries who were slightly behind. On top of everything else, this man with a black blindfold had a wicker wooden basket, in which, just the same, Fan Xian was lying in the body of a baby. This man threw a basket into the sky. He himself, at this time, took his sharp sword in his hands and was ready to attack. The hilt of the sword lit up with a bright blue light. The mercenaries practically attacked him. This blindfolded man was Fan Zhu Kaimu's servant named Wu Zhu. The sword completely lit up with a bright blue light. Baby Fan Xian, wrapped in a blue sheet, was lying in a basket, being in the sky at this time. Fan Xian was all disheveled from shock. Cold sweat was pouring down his face. He opened his mouth in horror, thinking that death was about to overtake him again. At this time, the same man with a black blindfold, named Wu Zhu, dealt with a bunch of mercenaries, wounding them with his sharp sword, which was filled with bright blue energy. Fan Xian touched his chubby cheeks with his small hands. The realization came to him that he had opened his eyes and discovered that he was at that time in a bamboo wicker basket in the form of a baby. The basket fell right into Mr. Wu Zhu's hands. He examined a bunch of wounded mercenaries and relaxed a little, realizing that he was able to deal with everyone. Fan Xian concluded that he had retained all his memories of the modern world, and here he was surrounded everywhere by assassins in black robes. Fan Xian pressed his small lips together and looked at Wu Zhu. He also concluded that this man with a black blindfold, who was protecting the baby, was very strong. There was admiration in his brown eyes. Footsteps were heard behind this man. He turned around, holding the basket with the baby Fan Xian with his hand. There were 5 more assassins in front of him. They, in strange robes made of bones and even with a staff on the end of which was a human skull, attacked Wu Zhu, wishing him death. He dealt with a bunch of blue-robed assassins with just one blow of his sharp sword with bright blue energy. Fan Xian opened his mouth in horror. A man with a staff on which a human skull was adorned was hit by an arrow. It pierced through his neck, releasing drops of red liquid. The killer dropped dead. However, for prevention, he was shot with a couple more arrows. The shooters were black knights in iron armor. Then, a man dressed in expensive clothes and jewelry drove up on a metal stroller with an intricate pattern. This man was the head of the Nanman prosecutor's office named Chen Pingping. He said that they underestimated this man with a staff on which there was a human skull, who was a magician who came from the West. He also said that before strong magic, anything would be like a pen that some minister wrote with. He meant that all these manipulations would be completely useless. Chen Pingping then looked at Wu Zhu's servant with all seriousness and asked about the baby's sister. Pursing his lips slightly, Wu Zhu said that he didn't have time to pick her up either. He then said that he would very much like Mr. Chen Pingping to explain everything to him. He frowned at the bridge of his nose and sternly looked at Wu Zhu. Then he asked if he was the child of the woman he had in mind. The man with a black blindfold answered positively. Then the head of the Nanman prosecutor's office asked if the baby was alive. The man also briefly agreed. Wu Zhu's servant turned on his heel and walked away. Chen Pingping asked the man where he should deliver the baby Fan Xian, to which he sternly replied that he had to take the boy to a safe place. Chen Pingping pierced Wu Zhu's figure with his cold gaze. He said that he had recently returned back and, in his opinion, the capital was the most suitable safe place, to which Wu Zhu's servant sternly cut off the words that he did not believe the gentleman who was served by the head of the Nanman prosecutor's office, Chen Pingping. He slightly rolled his eyes and asked what Wu Zhu could give this child, since this man with a black blindfold named Wu Zhu was blind. According to Chen Pingping, even if Zhu's kung fu was the best skill in the world, honed to perfection, but all this man could do was kill. Wu Zhu's servant briefly replied to him that he was as crippled as Chen Pingping himself. From such words, the man sitting on the wheelchair gripped her handrail tightly with his hand that even his knuckles turned white. Wu Zhu stopped. Chen Pingping relaxed his arm. He then reported that he knew a good and suitable safe place where Wu Zhu could get a new identity and a serene life together with the baby. He turned slightly and asked what kind of place it was. Chen Pingping briefly replied that it was a city called Danzhou. Some time later, Wu Zhu arrived at the Danzhou palace with a bamboo basket containing the baby Fan Shen. Several years have passed. The months passed quickly enough. In the spring, with the cranes flying by. In winter, when the snow was falling. In autumn, when the dry orange leaves fell. The seasons changed one after another. A group of kids were sitting at the steps of the palace, surrounded by white stone sculptures of Hachai. A boy with brown hair was telling the guys some stories. A blonde girl smiled sweetly and called her brother, telling him that he had told them the story to the very end last time. The little ones were all in attention, clenching their little fists. They were really waiting for the boy to tell them the story to the end. After examining the guys, he told that the story said that the traveler reached the Chinese wall and saw a ladder there. He climbed it slowly, step by step. Then the traveler found a door and entered it. The baby, with a baby tooth that had fallen out the day before, opened his mouth wide in surprise and asked what happened next. Then, the little boy named Fan Shen grinned as he looked at the other guys. What happened then? And then, to be continued. People were moving briskly along the street. Someone was just walking, and someone was doing all sorts of work. The kids, at this time, moved to a completely different place from the steps, namely, somewhere in the alley, where there was a bunch of boards and various abandoned objects. Little Fan Shen stood on a stack of wooden planks, emotionally telling a story. He raised his hands up and smiled, shouting that this was how the hero prevented an enemy invasion. Then he announced that this was the end of the story. From such an emotional outburst, a passing black cat was terribly frightened. Other kids were surprised by the end of the story. They clearly still had a lot of questions. One of the guys was thinking about everything, digesting such a story. He even closed his eyes and scratched his forehead. Another kid put his index fingers together in embarrassment, telling Fan Shen that he liked the Manners story more. The little girl with the ponytails raised her hand up and expressed her opinion that it seemed to her that the foggy journey was much more interesting than this story. Fan Shen, who now turns out to be called Fan Xian, waved his hand and pouted, telling the other kids that they didn't understand anything. Then another little girl with a bun on her head came running, shouting to a boy named Fan Xian that he needed to run home as soon as possible, since his household manager was beating the maids again. The boy froze, his mouth slightly open. At that time, in Danzhou Prefecture, the same household manager was hitting a blonde maid with a whip. He glared at the girl angrily, swinging again. He told the blonde maid to tell him quickly where the mistress had gone. She, trembling all over and trying to cover herself with her hands, her voice lost from fear and beatings, turned to the manager, telling him that the girl really did not know where this lady could go. He hit her again. There were several other maids sitting next to this blonde maid. Next to her was a submissive pink-haired girl with a downcast look from fear. The blonde maid, gradually crawling away from the whip, reported that the same pink-haired maid named Liu Zai should know where the mistress could be, since it was Liu Zai who served the young master. The manager turned his creepy gaze on Liu Zai. She clenched her fists in fear and, stammering, said that the young master forbade her to talk about the whereabouts of the mistress. The manager clenched the whip in his hand, even to the point of trembling. Then he told the maid that if she didn't tell him about it, he would beat her to death. She opened her mouth in horror. There was a strong thought process in the girl's head. The young master was her master, whom she had to obey without fail. And the manager is the manager. He had every right to punish the maids. It was a terrible, vicious circle. The girl, realizing this, did not know what to do. Then she straightened up and said that the manager of the household could beat her to death, expressing her devotion to the young master. The manager opened his mouth in surprise and said that the pink-haired maid was surprisingly very obedient. Then he swung his whip and angrily said that since Liu Zai says so, he can no longer hold back. When the whip almost hit the maid, Fan Xian's voice was heard sharply stopping the manager. It was really him. Besides, he was also holding the hand of another girl. Apparently, this was the little lady. The manager clenched his jaw and muttered through his teeth that if the young lady disappeared, what would the young master do? Then he said that he couldn't teach Fan Xian a lesson, but he could teach the maids who couldn't stand the boy. He hit the blonde maid with the whip again. The little lady named Fan Zhuo pulled her brother's sleeve slightly, asking the boy to give her the floor since the manager was still a snob and he could explain everything to him. He smiled warmly and stroked the girl's hair, telling her that he could not allow her to protect him at all. At this time, the evil manager was also hitting other maids with a whip. This time, Liu Zai also got it. He shouted, asking the maids if they knew what they were guilty of. He asked them if they were thinking about the future of the young master, continuing to beat the maids. Fan Ziyan walked past him. The manager again brought the whip behind him and, with eyes sparkling with anger, informed the maids that today he would improve their memory. Fan Ziyan told Tom to stop again. He stood with his feet on a wooden stool. Fan Ziyan then grinned and waved to Tom, asking the manager to come to him. The latter, holding a whip in his hands, approached. Ziyan told me to come a little closer. He put his small hands on the man's head, and the man looked at him attentively. The boy told him to keep his head straight. He wanted to ask the little master something, but did not have time. Fan Ziyan took a good swing and slapped the manager hard in the face, even knocking out a tooth. And then, as it turned out, a few more. The man flew away from the boy and rolled head over heels to the side. Fan Ziyan frowned and asked the manager if he was convinced of his rightness. The manager, terrified and in pain, gradually got up from the ground, lamenting that the young master was doing such atrocities, even at such a young age. Then he turned around and shouted through tears to the boy that he would tell his grandmother everything. Some time later, at an audience with Fan Ziyan's grandmother, the man smiled guiltily and said that today in the pavilion, the young gentleman hit him, thus doing very right. Having lunch with Fan Zhuo and Fan Xiang, Grandma Fan was silent, listening attentively. The young gentleman pointed his finger at the manager and told his grandmother that she could see for herself that this very manager had said that the boy had done everything right. Fan Zhuo stood up and said that the manager beat her brother's maids for no reason. Grandma Fan, without interrupting lunch, calmly ordered to change all the maids in the pavilion. Fan Ziyan. He, chewing his rice, told his grandmother that there was no need for this, since the boy liked silence, so there was no need for such a large number of people. Hearing the words of her grandson, she ordered the manager of the household, in that case, to recall all the maids home. He bowed excitedly and was about to leave the room. However, Fan Ziyan slyly smiled with a full row of teeth and pointed his finger down, whispering to him that they would see if he would dare to mock people belonging to Fan Ziyan again. The manager clenched his teeth in indignation. Then the grandmother closed some dishes with a lid and said that as soon as they were done, the girl would be taken back to the capital. In shock, she began to call her grandmother, but she was adamant. Fan Zhuo lowered her sad gaze to the table, pursing her lips. The manager chuckled. Fan Ziyan looked at his sister in frustration. After finishing his meal, he walked down the corridor to his pavilion. On the way, he met Liu Zai, who was waiting for him. The boy asked why the pink-haired girl had not yet returned home. The latter, blushing deeply, said that Cici had been sold here as a servant, since her parents did not need her at all. Her eyes began to get wet from rolling tears. She said that Cici, except for this place, had no other home to go to. Fan Ziyan raised his eyebrows sadly as he looked at the little maid. Then the boy walked a little further and smiled, telling the maid that they were similar. She asked in surprise. Fan Ziyan reported that he also had neither father nor mother. The latter, continuing to be more surprised, said that the young gentleman, after all, has a father who lives in the capital. Fan Ziyan chuckled and told her that she could assume that he was gone. Then he slyly looked at the little girl and said that, in that case, she could stay here. But, after slamming the door, he warned Liu Zai that she should be mentally prepared for the fact that old man Zhu, apparently the manager, would mock her again. She looked at the closed door in shock. Then the girl smiled shyly, thinking to herself that Cici was ready for anything. At night, Fan Ziyan lay on his bed and stared at the ceiling. He was thinking about what could be interesting in the capital. He wondered what kind of food Fan Zhuo usually eats in the capital. The boy frowned at the bridge of his nose and pursed his lips. He was thinking that the food in the capital must be better than the local one. Fan Ziyan then opened his eyes wide, thinking that he should probably put it out of his mind. He thought it would be better to think about the future than about this. Then the boy rolled over on his side and fell asleep. And at this time, a man was sitting on the roof of the roof and watching the boy through the roof window. After twisting around, Fan Ziyan lay back down again. Then he opened his eyes, on which was directly written spiritual strength. The boy muttered that he couldn't sleep at all. Then he pushed back his turquoise pillow, lifting it with both hands. The boy giggled, saying that it was finally time to take a look at his precious treasure. This treasure was a yellow, slightly battered nameless book. The dark-haired boy opened the book, making a strangely adult face with characteristic sunken cheekbones and plump lips. The boy read it with interest, thinking that this book was left to him by the same blind servant named Wu Zhu when Fan Ziyan was very young. Various fighting stands were drawn in the books. The boy immediately realized what it was when he first saw it. It was a kind of Kai energy cultivation method. The boy giggled, thinking that hard work compensates for the lack of talent. Fan Xian stretched out his hands holding the book tightly and looked at her. He thought that even if this method is no good, nothing bad will obviously happen if the boy practices it. There was a thunderstorm over the city of Danzhou. Lightning flashed brightly in the sky. Fan Xian was sitting alone in the room and enthusiastically reading this yellow-covered book. A man with shoulder-length hair, only whose outline was visible in the dark, was watching the boy. Fan Xian was still reading his book. Bright lightning flashed. The outline of the man behind lit up. He was looking at the kid with bright red eyes. The boy, feeling the movement, opened his eyes wide with horror and looked up from the yellow book. He shifted his gaze slightly back. Behind him stood a tall, white-haired man with a blade on his back. He asked the boy in a creepy voice if he was Fan Xian. The boy silently looked at the book and did not move. Suddenly, a dark-haired boy pounced on a man agitated from shock with hugs. Fan Xian called him father and shouted with joy because he was back. The gray-haired man, whose name turned out to be Fei Jai, raised his eyebrows in surprise and asked the boy again. The young gentleman clung to his arm and started shouting that the white-haired man named Fei Jai was his father. He tried to throw this kid off his arm and shouted back at him that he was not his father. As a result, after all this turmoil, the boy was thrown back with pieces of thick fabric of Fei Jai's sleeve. Once on the floor, the boy was silent for a while and then apologized to his father. He clenched his teeth, pointed a finger at himself, and said what he repeats once again, that he was never his father. After a few moments, Fan Xian made tea and brought a white teapot to Fei Jai, offering his father a soothing cup of tea. The gray-haired man sternly looked at the dark-haired boy and said that he was telling him for the last time that he was not his father. Fan Xian looked at the man plaintively, with burning tears in his eyes. He sighed and drops of cold sweat slid over his body. Fei Jai agreed to drink some tea. After drinking a little from the spout of the teapot, Jai asked about who made this tea. Fan Xian smiled brightly and said that his mother had prepared it. The man raised his eyebrows in surprise and said that it was all nonsense, since Fan Xian's mother died on his birthday. The boy shouted to the man that his mother was always there. After drinking some more tea, Fei Jai dropped the words that the boy was talking nonsense. Then the white-haired man took a look at his purple robes. The sleeve was badly torn by a boy named Fan Xian. He thought hard, examining the torn sleeve. By the way, the fabric of Fei Jai's clothes is so strong that it is not easy to scratch it even with a knife. He did not understand at all how a 4-year-old child managed to tear these clothes. Then the man looked at the wall, sipping some more tea. Fan Xian shouted joyfully that his mother had finally come. Hearing these words, Fei Jai's eyes widened in shock. Then he turned towards the door, not believing his eyes. However, it was completely empty, just as the white-haired man thought. Suddenly, Fan Xian found himself behind a man with some heavy, stone, turquoise-colored thing in his hands. A tired Fei Jai chuckled, saying that, as he thought, the appearance of Fan Xian's mother was impossible. The dark-haired boy hit the man hard on the head, and he did not expect it at all. Fei Jai flew to the side and collapsed on the floor. Fan Xian began to approach closer. Fei Jai sighed heavily from the pain. The dark-haired boy swung a piece of heavy turquoise stone again and smashed it on the head of a gray-haired man named Fei Jai. He lost consciousness due to pain shock. Sweat was running down the young master's face. He spread his fingers on his hand and looked at them carefully. The boy's eyebrows were drawn down to the bridge of his nose. He was clearly not happy. Fan Xian thought that the man was somehow too nimble, like a snake. The boy put all his strength into his fingers, thinking that he could hold him. However, who could have known at all that he would only catch onto these rags? The boy was tormented by the question of who this gray-haired man was, who was now lying unconscious in Fan Xian's room. A dark-haired boy with a bun on his head went down to Fei Jai and put his finger on his nose. The boy frowned even more, expressing anger and dissatisfaction, because he had used 100% of his energy to strike 2 whole blows, and this man named Fei Jai was still breathing. The boy was quite afraid that the gray-haired man would try to kill him when he woke up. Fan Xian opened his eyes wide because he had an epiphany. He thought about why he shouldn't kill Fei Jai first in order to prevent his assassination attempt. Fan Xian took out a blade from behind the man's back and raised it over him. He took a closer look at his thick gray hair. Then the boy tightened his grip on the blade in his hand, even to the point of trembling. A cold drop of sweat ran down his face. Fan Xian froze with the blade in his hands, considering the murder. Fan Xian ran towards some wooden building. He began to bang hard and very loudly on the large and dense wooden doors. The boy began to call Uncle Wushu very loudly. He repeated his name several times, continuing to knock very loudly on the doors. An irritated blind man with a black blindfold clucked and told Fan Xian that his store was already closed, and if the boy wanted to buy something from him, then he should come tomorrow. Fan Xian began to knock more quietly. However, he began to shout much louder to Uncle Wu Zhu that someone had tried to kill him. A man with a black blindfold leaned against the wall, asking what this boy wanted. He assumed that the boy wanted Wu Zhu to report the boy to the police. Fan Xian began to speak more quietly and stopped knocking on doors altogether. He informed a blind uncle named Wu Zhu that no police were needed, since the boy had killed his potential killer. The boy continued to whisper that even though that killer Fei Jai tried to kill Fan Xian, however, the young master was able to get ahead of him. The man with the black blindfold turned slightly and opened his mouth slightly. He was surprised by the boy's words and said that he was talking utter nonsense. Fan Xian whined again, calling for Uncle Wu Zhu. He started banging his little fists loudly on the doors again and shouting heart-rendingly for Uncle Wu Zhu to stop pretending. Fan Xian was screaming that he urgently needed help. Fan Xian continued to bang furiously and very loudly with his small fists on the wooden door of the uncle named Wu Zhu. The boy screamed heart-rendingly, calling for Uncle Wu Zhu. He was saying that now was not the time to pretend indifference at all. The excited boy kept knocking on the wooden door, shouting to him that a blind man in a black blindfold had been hiding in this store for years and refused Fan Xian, but now it was really very important. He shouted that Uncle Wu Zhu had to take care of the boy. The wooden door suddenly opened. Fan Xian, holding his fist ready for another loud knock, froze, his mouth slightly open in surprise. Before him appeared the blind Uncle Wu Zhu, whose face expressed equanimity. Although he looked like that, he said that the young gentleman surprised him quite a lot. After standing for another second, Fan Xian came out of his stupor and abruptly grabbed Wu Zhu's hand. Then he ran, forcing the blind man in a black blindfold to run after him. The boy shouted that they had had enough of talking and told Uncle Wu Zhu to follow him quickly. Then the boy said that he would show Tom everything now. Back in Fan Xian's room, Uncle Wu Zhu put 2 fingers on Fei Jai's neck, looking for a pulse. Although the gray-haired man was unconscious, Wu Zhu reported that he was still alive. Fan Xian asked in shock. Then he said that he hit the gray-haired man 2 times. He was completely perplexed as to how he was still alive. Wu Zhu then said that Fei Jai was actually there. He didn't have time to finish. Fei Jai slowly opened his eyes. Seeing that he had woken up, Fan Xian struck him with lightning speed and the man lost consciousness again. Wu Zhu went on to say that in fact, this white-haired man named Fei Jai was the commander of the 3rd audit chamber. That is, he was his own. The boy, holding a wooden stool in his hands, asked in shock. Having dropped the fragments of the wooden stool from his hands, Fan Xian began to emotionally question Uncle Wu Zhu about why he did not tell the boy about this before Xian smashed this stool against him. To which the imperturbable Wu Zhu countered Fan Xian by saying that he did not ask him about it. Fan Xian shifted his gaze to the white-haired man. Fei Jai was lying all bruised, and foam was coming out of his mouth. The boy yelled and said that he didn't look too happy. The blind man reported that the unconscious man's name was Fei Jai. He also said that he was one of the 3 best masters of poisons in the world. In addition, this white-haired man was good both in the production of poisons and in their application, as well as in antidotes. Fan Xian opened his mouth in shock and said that Fei Jai is such a cool person. The boy was worried about whether Fei Jai would take offense at him after all these acts of self-defense. Then the imperturbable Fan Xian handed the blade to his uncle Wu Zhu and said that the uncle should silence this man. Besides, it would be a secret that only uncle and nephew can share. To which the unperturbed Wu Zhu muttered that the boy was so cruel and merciless at such a young age. He was worried about the question of who taught this kid to be like that. Wu Zhu then stood up and straightened out, saying that even though Fei Jai was subordinate to Fan Xian's father, it was not at all clear to him why the gray-haired man came here, straight to Danzhou, this time. After a few moments, Fei Jai grimaced in pain and tried to get up to sit down. When he managed to do this, he grabbed his sore head and swore in not very good words. Then he opened his eyes and saw in front of him a calm Wu Zhu, trembling from shock, moreover, with a blade belonging to Fei Jai in his hand, Fan Xian, staring at him with his huge eyes. After a second, the boy hid the blade behind his back and began to whistle some song, pretending that he was not involved at all. After a certain period of time, Fei Jai received medical assistance. He sat with his head wrapped in a bandage, scratching the bandages with his hand, and asked what had happened to him. Beads of sweat were running down his face. Fan Xian made the cutest expression that could ever be made and said that Fei Jai took a sip of tea, and then just fainted. Then the man with the bandaged head turned a suspicious look at the boy and asked why then his head was bleeding. To which Fan Xian calmly replied that Fei Jai hit his head on the table when falling. The white-haired man chuckled and asked if Fan Xian had done his best. He laughed and began to wave his hands excitedly, saying that this was not the case and in general, how could he have done such a thing? Then Fei Jai moved closer to the boy and asked in a creepy voice who did it, if not him. Fan Xian, drenched in cold sweat, sharply pointed his finger at Uncle Wu Zhu, saying that it was he who did it. Wu Zhu lowered his head slightly, but did not reply. Fei Jai chuckled, holding his aching head with his hand and wondering how it all happened. He asked that. Apparently, Fei Jai had done something very bad, since their great lord Wu Zhu decided to do such a thing. Wu Zhu immediately replied that he didn't do it. Then he pointed his finger at Fan Xian and said that he did it. Fei Jai turned around, calmly examining the boy who was tense with excitement. Wu Zhu then showed 3 fingers and said that Fan Xian had done it not once, but 3 times. Fei Jai's face turned black with anger, so that only his mustache was visible, and his eyes burned with a bright red light, expressing anger. Fan Xian shivered all over and began to pour cold sweat even more, as if it was raining. After a while, Fei Jai and Wu Zhu had a nice conversation. The white-haired man spoke with all seriousness that he did not think that the great Lord Wu Zhu was also in Danzhou. He grunted and scratched his chin. It seemed incredible to him that after so many years in the capital, Wu Zhu had not changed at all, neither externally nor internally. Wu Zhu then calmly inquired about what Mr. Fei Jai was doing here in Danzhou. He spread his arms to the sides and said that the Lord had paid him a tidy sum in order for the man to become the master of Fan Xian. The boy raised his eyebrows and opened his mouth in shock, surprised that the boy's father had sent this man to him. Wu Zhu sternly said that Fan Xian's father had not informed him about this. The gray-haired man shrugged his shoulders and said that the young master was gradually maturing, and the sooner he could start training, the more chances the boy would have in the distant and near future. Then the old man chuckled and said that it didn't matter at all what Wu Zhu's opinion of him was. However, if he wishes, the white-haired man named Fei Jai will return to the capital. He said that he was sure that the Lord would support him in this. The man with the black blindfold chuckled and said he didn't think it was that simple. He thought there must have been another reason. Fei Jai cast a strange look from under his forehead at Wu Zhu. Then he reported that the Lord was afraid that someone else would find the box left by the mistress. Therefore, Fei Jai would like to get some advice. To which Wu Zhu calmly replied that this was not necessary at all, since the lady destroyed this box before her death. Fei Jai breathed a sigh of relief and said that, in that case, everything is fine. Fan Xian, at this time, closed his eyes, sitting on the sofa and picking at his ear with his finger. Fei Jai reported that, by the way, it always seemed to him that the young master was somehow strange, since he was only 4 years old when he asked to learn Qigong. The man asked if the boy was really not scared at all, to which Wu Zhu said that it was really strange. That's why he didn't teach him. Wu Zhu then turned on his heels towards the exit, finally saying that it was good now, since Fan Xian now has Mr. Fei Jai. The white-haired man thought about it. A drop of sweat trickled down his face again. He looked at the sleeping Fan Xian, whose mouth was open and saliva was flowing down it. Fei Jai had an ominous premonition. The next day, early in the morning, Danzhou was illuminated by the singing of birds. The sun was shining brightly. The day should have been fine. At the morning audience, Grandma Fan asked what had happened to Mr. Fei Jai's head. He respectfully bowed to the elderly woman, handing her a red envelope with a yellow center. He reported that Master Fan assigned this Mr. Fei Jai mentors to Fan Xiang, but on the way to them in Danzhou, a gray-haired man was attacked by some bandit. An elderly woman exclaimed in horror, and then asked if the bandit had been caught. Fei Jai convinced Granny Fan not to worry, since this bandit had already been caught. Behind Fei Jai, Fan Xian stood nervously. He didn't move from embarrassment and shame. Fei Jai slightly shifted his gaze back to Fan Xian, whose face was dripping with cold sweat. Then the man said that although this villain was cunning, but Fei Jai clearly decided to find a way to teach him a good lesson. Then the man slyly and maliciously giggled. The boy was terrified. After the conversation, Fei Jai and little Fan Xian walked down the corridor together. The maids looked out, looked at them and immediately whispered. The blonde girl reported that the gray-haired man was the young master's new master. The red-haired girl asked again. She couldn't believe her eyes, as Fei Jai with a bandage on his head looked more like a robber. The blonde maid reported that everything was exactly like that, because she knew that the elderly lady had personally received him. Then she said that he would now be their young master's mentor. A man and a child entered the pavilion under the whispers of the maids. Moments later, Fei Jai was sitting on a chair with his feet propped up on a small table. He was fanning himself with a round fan while Fan Xian was kneading his shoulders with his small fists. Fan Xian tried to convince old Fei Jai that his teacher could not blame the boy for what had happened, since teacher Fei had a knife in his hands yesterday. Besides, the boy was still young and, in his opinion, that's why he acted so rashly. The white-haired man was silent, continuing to wave his fan at himself. Then, inspired by Fan Xian, he asked teacher Fei Jai about what he was going to teach the dark-haired boy. Fei Jai opened his eyes wide and looked at Fan Xian eerily. Then he said that he would teach him how to kill people with poison and how not to be poisoned by others. Fan Xian, instead of being terribly scared, jumped up and screamed with joy. The white-haired man stopped fanning himself in surprise. There was even a cold sweat on his face. The man did not expect such a reaction from a small child at all. Fan Xian, who was too active, stretched his hand up and loudly asked teacher Fei about what they were waiting for in this case. The boy strenuously offered the man to start classes right now. Fan Xian then asked if he could catch a couple of rats as test subjects. Fei Jai broke out in a cold sweat because of the shock. He was completely perplexed, seeing what was happening. A man with a bandage on his head wondered if this guy was really only 4 years old. Fan Xian, at this time, could not get enough of what interesting activities were waiting for them ahead. In the dead of night, Fei Jai, holding a bayonet shovel and a burning torch, and Fan Xian walked through the cemetery. Approaching the tombstones, teacher Fei reported that it was a mobile Luan mound. Looking at everything around with interest, the boy said that he sees everything himself. Then the white-haired man turned around and looked at Fan Xian with a creepy look, telling him that the boy should choose his grave and then dig it out. The man was trying to make the boy as creepy as possible. However, he was not at all afraid and happily announced that he had chosen one of the graves. Stroking the tombstone piece of wood, Fei Jai's eyes bulged in shock. Then Fan Xian peeked out from behind the grave piece of wood and, imitating a puppy dog look, said that he was just a little kid. Then the boy asked the man about why he would not help the baby. Teacher Fei Jai calmly threw a bayonet shovel towards the boy and told him to dig. Fan Xian gasped. Then the boy began to dig the ground to dig out the very grave. It yielded easily enough. While Fei Jai was drinking something from a jug lying under a tree, Fan Xian had already dug a big enough hole. After a few moments, Fan Xian breathed a sigh of relief, holding the shovel tightly in his hands. Sweat trickled down his face because of such physical exertion on such a small body. After examining the wooden coffin, the boy informed the master that everything was already ready. Then he asked, clarifying that now, apparently, it was necessary to open the coffin. Fan Xian inserted some kind of stick into the coffin, imitating a crowbar, and was almost ready to crack it. However, teacher Fei immediately appeared and stopped the boy. He asked the young gentleman if he even understood why Fei Jai had brought him here. Fan Xian, meanwhile flexing his arm, calmly replied that of course he understands everything. Then the young master said that teacher Fei had brought him here to perform an autopsy and study the structure of the human body. The boy thought it was a great first step. Fei Jai opened his mouth in surprise. He did not understand at all how this child could know all this. Then he raised his eyebrows and asked Fan Xian if the boy wasn't a bit afraid. Before he could finish, Fan Xian broke the coffin lid into small pieces with one blow. The man was in severe shock. Then Xian turned around and asked the teacher about what he had said. Fei Jai cleared his throat and said he hadn't said anything. Then he handed the young gentleman a knife and ordered to open the body and then to find out the cause of death of this man. The boy raised his eyebrows and slowly picked up the knife. Then he bent over the coffin, pursing his lips. Sweat was running down his forehead. Fan Xian stared at the already rotten corpse with his mouth open. Looking at the slightly sad and sweat-soaked face of young Mr. Fan, Fei Jai began to happily poke his fingers at him, asking if the baby was finally scared. Inwardly, the gray-haired man rejoiced with joy. He was glad that this terribly brave child was finally scared. However, the boy moved away from the grave wooden coffin and spread his arms to the sides, saying that he was not afraid at all. Then the boy raised one eyebrow and said that, after all, there are a lot of different microbes. Then Fan Xian said that after all, he needed some kind of protection before poking around in the body for the benefit of science. Fei Jai's eyes bulged in shock and asked Fan Xian what he meant by protection. He pointed to the coffin with his hand and said that, at least, it was very dirty there. Then he asked about whether teacher Fei had gloves. He immediately reported in a stern voice that the autopsy was a very delicate job. He was completely perplexed how it would be possible to wear gloves during such work. Xian immediately replied to him that he was talking about thin gloves, which were practically invisible on his hands. Fei Jai stuck out his tongue, teasing the boy. He then said that he had never heard anything about it, and also he just suggested that Xiang wash his hands thoroughly afterwards. After all the arguments with Master Fei, the boy sighed heavily, holding his head. Well, apparently, he had no other choice. Fei Jai was sitting on a hillock and still drinking something from a jug. Meanwhile, Fan Xian was busily digging into the coffin while performing an autopsy on the body. The white-haired man chuckled and said that since the boy was so smart, he must surely guess why Fei Jai would like to teach him how to use poisons. The boy, not at all distracted from such an important matter, replied to him that someone, in any case, would definitely want to kill Fan Xian in the future, so the young master needed to learn how to use poisons so that they could not poison him later. The gray-haired man looked away and said that although Mr. Wuzhu was not susceptible to poison, but he would not be able to protect Fan Xian from him, no matter how much he wanted to. The boy turned around and asked Master Fei if he could tell the boy more about Uncle Wuzhu. He said that Wuzhu was a servant of Fan Xian's mother, and he was not inferior to the 4 great masters in skill. Fan Xian turned around again and asked about that. Wasn't his mother very powerful? Fei Jai sighed with admiration, saying that the boy's mother was simply incomparable. Then the young gentleman asked about how his mother died, to which the man replied that he could not tell him about it and then took another sip from his uncomplicated jug. Then a gray-haired man with a bandage on his head chuckled and asked where such a young child had so many such questions. Then he asked the boy that, really, he could no longer restrain himself. The boy looked at him with a long smile. Then nausea began to roll up to his mouth. He couldn't hold back any longer and vomited a rainbow of food that Fan Xian had eaten just recently. Fei Jai laughed and said that there were times when there was no longer enough urine to endure. He continued to laugh out loud while holding onto his big belly. Fan Xian, with drool near his mouth and tears in his eyes, looked contemptuously at the teacher, slightly lost in thought. Oh, this teacher. Fei Jai smiled and pointed at the boy, telling him that this was just the beginning. And then everything will only get worse. Then the man burst into loud laughter again. The next morning, Fei Jai, as if nothing had happened, was sitting on a chair, drinking a drink from a jug and holding his round braided fan in his hands. Fan Xian was sitting opposite the man, also on a chair, but with his body bent down. The boy was still sick from his nocturnal adventures, the autopsy of the corpse, and the fact that he had been trying to restrain himself for a very long time. A gray-haired man with a bandage on his head handed a dark-haired boy a wooden plate with Chinese baozi dumplings. Fan Xian looked at the plate sadly. He was obviously still sick that even a piece of food could not get down his throat. In addition, the boy clearly did not get enough sleep due to the fact that they spent half the night at the cemetery for the autopsy of the body. There were bruises under the baby's eyes. Fei Jai smiled slightly as he handed the plate to the boy and asked him if he wasn't tired after such a night. Then he told the boy to eat his baozi dumplings as soon as possible. Fan Xian pouted his lips and thought about the fact that, as it turned out, this, in Xian's opinion, a nasty old man, had a kind side. The man again asked the boy about why he was looking at him like that and again told him to eat baozi rather. Little Fan Xian picked up a large dumpling that barely fit in his hand and grinned. He then turned to his teacher Fei and said that he noticed that he was very polite to Uncle Wuzhu. The boy was interested in the fact that, really, this adult man was afraid of him. Fei Jai looked away and said that he had absolutely no reason to be afraid of Mr. Wuzhu, and it was just simple respect. After taking a bite of the dumpling, Xian smiled and asked the old man if Uncle Wuzhu wasn't a very cool person. He paused in thought. Then he leaned on his arm and smiled slightly. Then he told the boy that all the warriors were divided into as many as 9 ranks. Besides, only 4 of them had a rank higher than 9th. The teacher from Nanjing has never lost a single duel in his entire life. A teacher from the Kai dynasty claimed that he was an intimate of the gods. The master from the city of Dunny said that he could protect an entire city with just 1 sword. The old man said that there was another such person. This man was guarding His Majesty in the palace in Nanjing. Besides, he had already saved His Majesty from assassination attempts twice. If one person had not committed a misdemeanor, then there would be 5 great masters in the world. Fan Xian's eyes lit up with a bright light, and bright stars appeared instead of pupils. Admiring Uncle Wuzhu, he clenched his fists. The boy did not think that his blind Uncle Wuzhu was so cool. Then the kid told the old man that, one day, Mr. Wuzhu gave him a book about Kai energy. Then he asked Fei Jai, asking him that the boy was probably very strong. He chuckled and said that the Kai energy in Fan Xian's body was really very strong. The boy got up from his chair with joy, shouting that he knew this. Then a gray-haired man with a bandage on his head poked his finger at the child and said that he was very strong, even though he had not been training for so long. In addition, the amount of Kai energy greatly exceeded the capabilities of the boy's age and body. Little Fan Xian stopped and asked his teacher again, "Wait, what?" The kid didn't understand at all whether it was good or bad. After finishing the meal, Fei Jai took his disciple to the bed and said that the boy had to train his Kai energy properly. Then he asked Fan Xian to let him help with this, and first the boy had to sit up straight. The dark-haired boy folded his legs in a lotus position and put his hands palms up, while closing his eyes. Fan Xian asked if he had sat down correctly. An old man named Fei Jai touched the boy's small hands and told him to release the Kai energy and feel its flow inside him. He also said that Fan Xiang was only 5 years old. No matter how strong his true Kai energy is, the kid will not be able to surprise teacher Fei. He only replied with the word good. Fan Xian closed his eyes and concentrated. The energy of the dark-haired boy raged around with a bright golden-orange light, as if fiery. The young gentleman pulled his dark eyebrows to the bridge of his nose and whispered something about the sources of energy that could not be suppressed. The fiery bright golden energy began to rage even stronger. Fan Xian opened his eyes and they lit up with a bright golden light. The boy's Kai energy began to flare up even brighter and rush out more quickly. The baby's body tensed. The Kai energy that was in Fan Xian's body burst out. After finishing the meditation, the boy opened his eyes and joyfully shouted to the teacher that he began to feel his energy. Then he paused for a second and gasped, realizing that teacher Fei was no longer standing next to him. Then he saw the old man Fei Jai flying to the far corner of the room. The boy ran towards him shouting his name. Old man Fei Jai slowly began to rise, rubbing his aching head with his palm. Fan Xian, all agitated, shouted for his teacher not to get up, because of the fault of the kid, he suffered. A white-haired man covered in cold sweat was lamenting something about Fan Xian being a little asshole. The old man did not understand at all how he could be so strong in his 5 years. Confused, Fan Xian scratched his head and smiled, saying that he also felt that he was quite capable. Then the kid giggled. Teacher Fei shouted at him with displeasure that it was not praise at all. The white-haired Fei Jai raised his gray eyebrows and sternly looked at the boy. Moving his thick mustache, he told the dark-haired boy that if Fan Xian continued to practice in the same spirit, then Fei Jai was very afraid that the Kai energy of this kid would just tear Fan Xian apart at some point. The boy looked at his teacher in horror and quietly asked again. Fei Jai pushed his gray eyebrows to the bridge of his nose and, gritting his teeth, said that Fan Xian was like a pumpkin with wine, and his Kai energy was wine. The more Fan Xian practiced, the more wine was poured into the gourd. Sooner or later this pumpkin would have burst. Fan Xian raised his dark eyebrows in horror. Cold sweat rolled down his face. He was shouting, asking the gray-haired man about what he should do now in this case. Fei Jai scratched his chin thoughtfully. It was really bad. It was really bad. A velvety voice was heard behind the old man. He turned around in surprise and saw Mr. Wu Zhu standing in the corner with his hands folded in front of him. Seeing Mr. Wu Zhu, an old man named Fei Jai asked the blind man about when he came. The kid ran to his uncle named Wu Zhu with the words that the energy given by the man with the black blindfold to little Fan Xiang was too strong. Wu Zhu briefly replied that it wasn't him. The Kai energy that was in the boy was left to him by his late mother. Little Fan Xian smiled and asked if this energy had a name. Wu Zhu answered briefly about what the name was. The kid immediately asked what the name was. He reported that the name of this energy was domineering and irritating Kai energy. Fan Xian took out his little finger and looked contemptuously at Uncle Wu Zhu, telling him that the name was too stupid. In addition, it was very suitable for Zhu, according to Fan Xian. Old man Fei Jai laughed and said that he was really worried. Then the gray-haired man turned to Master Wu Zhu, telling him that, given the strength of the blind man, he would certainly be able to cope with Fan Xian's training in controlling internal energy. The kid agreed with the old man, smiling broadly. Wu Zhu briefly replied that he couldn't do it. The old teacher and his little student froze in surprise. Then they opened their eyes wide and, in unison, stuttered, asked Uncle Wu Zhu, could he really not? The blind man calmly replied that he really couldn't teach Fan Xian. Old man Fei Jai and young master Fan Xian raised their eyebrows and looked at Mr. Wu Zhu strangely. Then they raised their hands again in unison and opened their mouths, shouting loudly about what they should do then. Fei Jai thought about it. Cold sweat was running down his face due to excitement. He was tormented by questions about how, by the way, this boy's body could contain such an impressive amount of internal energy at all. Was Fan Xian even human? The white-haired man was terrified. He thought it would be better for him not to mess with this boy. Fan Xian, at this time, was holding his head with his hands, terribly panicking. He was shouting that he was going to explode now. The little gentleman was very scared. The calm Mr. Wu Zhu reported that the boy named Fan Xian would not explode. The latter, hearing the words of his uncle, instantly froze and bulged his eyes. The old man named Fei Jai grunted and held out his hand pointing at Mr. Wu Zhu. He believed that Master Wu Zhu obviously had a solution. Little Fan Xian smiled and clenched his fists, asking his uncle Wu Zhu about what he had come up with a solution to this stalemate, to which he calmly replied that the inner energy of Kai Fan Xian could simply not be trained. Old Man Fei Jai and Little Fan Xian smiled for a second, frozen. Then they looked at Mr. Wu Zhu in horror, their eyes bulging and their mouths slightly open in shock. Just not to train energy, what? One day during the training, Old Man Fei Jai and Little Fan Xian climbed into the forest thicket. After some time wandering through the forest thicket, Teacher Fei Jai found the right mushroom. It's beautiful, pink in color and with an interesting pattern. A gray-haired man, already without a bandage on his head, pointed out the fungus to his disciple Zhang and told him to eat it. He smiled warily that even cold sweat dripped from his face, stretching out his little hands to this pink mushroom. After eating it, Little Fan Xian discovered that this mushroom was hallucinogenic. While Old Man Fei Jai calmly sipped his wine from a pumpkin jug, Fan Xian ran and jumped around the forest, seeing various hallucinations. The following year, under the most reliable supervision of Master Fei Jai, Little Fan Xian learned everything about poisons. He touched various mushrooms, ate them and so on. For example, because of the light brown long mushrooms with a small hat, Fan Xian's skin itched terribly. Pink furry mushrooms turned out to be hallucinogenic. Pink smooth mushrooms, if boiled, made the boy sick with their smell. And, if there wasn't a poison master by Fan Xiang's side, the young master would have left this world a long time ago. Returning from the forest thicket, from another lesson, happy as an elephant, Teacher Fei Jai knocked a pumpkin jug with wine on a simple wooden structure similar to a cart on which he and Fan Xian were sitting, leaning against a light wall. Rather, only Fei Jai was leaning, and the tortured Fan Xian was sitting on the edge. The gray-haired man grunted and scratched his gray mustache, telling the kid that the young gentleman had learned almost everything he could about poisons this year. The tortured child looked suspiciously at his teacher, asking him if Teacher Fei Jai really called this whole nightmare a study. The boy assumed that this was the old man's revenge for what Fan Xian had done to him in the beginning. Fan Xian looked off into the distance, clenching his teeth. Cold sweat was pouring down his face. Apparently, the young gentleman was still sick. In a trembling voice, he told an old man named Fei Jai that if it wasn't for his desire to survive, Fan Xian didn't know at all how many times he would have already managed to throw away his skates. Old man Fei Jai patted the boy on the head and said that he had survived anyway, so the young gentleman should not have focused so much on the educational process, because the result was pretty good. Fei Jai breathed a sigh of relief and smiled as he looked at the ceiling. Then he said that now, after all this, Old Man Fei Jai could finally leave with a calm soul. Hearing the old man's words, Fan Xian raised his dark eyebrows in surprise and asked the gray-haired man about his departure. Was Old Man Fei Jai already planning to return to the capital? He said with a slight sadness that he had already received the letter, and, therefore, in a month he returns back to the capital. The old man and the child sat in silence for a few moments, digesting the information. Then little Mr. Fan spoke up first and quietly asked about Fei Jai staying here for another month. Fei Jai rubbed his fists and made a creepy look, telling the boy that this month he must definitely take revenge on Fan Xiang for what happened to the gray-haired man's head a year ago, before he left for the capital. The kid opened his mouth in horror and screamed, asking his teacher that, hadn't he mocked Fan Xiang enough this year for the benefit of the educational process? Suddenly, a strong stream of blood spurted from Fan Xian's nose. He looked at his nose in surprise and clamped his hands over it out of fear. After taking a sip of some wine from the pumpkin jug, Old Man Fei Jai told the boy to calm down, as it was a common poisoning. He also said that the excitement accelerated the spread of the toxin through the body. Fan Xian was terrified. After a while, Teacher Fei and a student named Fan Xian were standing in front of the house, conducting another creepy lesson. On a small wooden table there were various jars of poisons, plugged with corks and fabrics. The old man named Fei Jai folded his hands in front of him and told the little gentleman to think carefully about what kind of poison it was when it got into the boy's body, and exactly how it happened. Then he said that it was only then that the gray-haired man would be able to make sure that he could leave his disciple. The young gentleman with a napkin in his nose thought hard that he even stuck out his tongue. He said that the poison had a bitter taste. From this it followed that this poison must have been mixed with medicine, so the boy did not notice its presence. The old man chuckled and told the boy then that, in that case, he would try to choose the right bottle with the help of what Fan Xian had learned. The dark-haired gentleman thought about it and began to sniff all the jars with different poisons in turn. The brown clay jar and the white bowl didn't immediately fit the smell, so Fan Xian threw them away. He also did the same with a white phial containing an unsuitable poison. taking the round little jug. Fan Xian sniffed it and opened his eyes wide. The boy had an epiphany. He sternly pulled out the right jug of poison and firmly told his teacher Fei Jai that it was this poison. He raised his eyebrows and told the boy, in that case, to drink it. Fan Xian opened his mouth wide and small purple droplets, as if from wine, poured into his mouth. He calmly swallowed the entire contents of the poison jug. At this time, the imperturbable old man Fei Jai picked up a bamboo umbrella and opened it. The boy looked at the teacher in surprise and said that he had guessed right. Blood began to drip from the nose of the young gentleman again, and then completely gushed out of both nostrils of the frightened Fan Xian, falling in red drops on the bamboo umbrella of an old man named Fei Jai. He chuckled and, as if nothing had happened, said that he had told the boy to choose, but the old man did not say that there was an antidote inside these jars. Little Fan Xian was lying on the ground in horror, rolling his eyes. Cold sweat was running down his face. The tortured boy was wailing about how someone like this old man Fei Jai could be a teacher at all. The man came closer and looked down at the boy. Then he suggested that the boy, in that case, try to poison the poison master Fei Jai. The boy stared at his teacher in surprise and asked again. He grinned and said that if Fan Xian managed to poison his teacher, then he would recognize his skills. The boy opened his eyes wide in surprise and agreed. Then he made the most ingenious face, taking his teacher weakly. Well, let's see who's who. When the sun had already set below the horizon and was replaced by a crescent moon, Fei Jai sighed and sipped wine from his pumpkin jug. When he heard a knock on the door, he was surprised and looked at who had come there at such a time. A smiling Fan Xian entered his master's chambers with a tray on which there was dinner for old man Fei Jai. A whole little chicken, sauce and wine in a white clay jug. The boy put the tray on his teacher's desk. The gray-haired man chuckled and said that the baby had been very cute lately. Did Fan Xian really not want to say goodbye to his teacher so much? He smiled and agreed with the old man's words. Fan Xian immediately turned on his heels and waved to the white-haired man with the words that Fei Jai enjoyed his dinner, and Fan Xian would not interfere with it. At this time, old man Fei Jai opened an earthenware jug of wine and sniffed it. He immediately stopped the kid, who froze, trembling slightly. The grinning white-haired man told the young gentleman to leave the food and take the wine. The boy turned around in shock to catch the jug that his teacher threw into the young master's hands. Fan Xian asked in shock that the old man really smelled the poison in the wine. He smiled and told the little boy to be tougher with him. Closing the door behind him, the young gentleman smiled slyly. It seems Fei Jai was caught on a poisonous hook. Some time later, in the afternoon, old man Fei Jai lay on a bamboo chaise longue and rested, drinking wine from his pumpkin jug. Fan Xian, at this time, was fanning his poison teacher with his round braided fan. The old man sighed with pleasure. Suddenly, a small trickle of scarlet liquid flowed from his nose. He looked at his nose in surprise. Then the gray-haired man abruptly stood up, his eyes bulging. A thick red liquid was pouring out of both of the poison master's nostrils. He was clearly surprised. Fan Xian laughed very loudly as he wiped the blood from his face with the brush of his hand. Happy as an elephant, the boy poked his finger at the gray-haired man and happily told his teacher that he had lost. The student has surpassed his teacher. While he was trying to stop the blood, he began to ask the boy about what kind of poison he used to win the teacher. The boy named Fan Xian smiled slyly and held up his index finger, saying that the poison he used was called time. Fan Xian then told that all these days he had been feeding old man Fei Jai with the best meat and fish, which he cooked with special tonic herbs, as well as delicious soup, which this cunning boy also cooked using the same tonic herbs. Old man Fei Jai, all these days, absorbed all this with pleasure, which caused the blood of the poison master to become thicker, since eating a large amount of tonic herbs was equivalent to using poison. Old man Fei Jai rubbed his forehead and sighed, telling his disciple Fan Xiang that he was pretty smart to have found such a cunning way. The young gentleman clenched his little fists with joy and asked the old man if he could now be considered a teacher. He chuckled, but was silent. A joyful Fan Xian jumped up and shouted that he had defeated his teacher. In the forest thicket, birds circled around the trees and chirped loudly. Old man Fei Jai was slowly leading his brown horse by the bridle, and little Fan Xian was walking beside him. When they reached a certain place in the forest thicket, they stopped. Old man Fei Jai closed his eyes and, smiling warmly, told the young master to just stick to his way, as places and people will always change. Little Fan Xian lowered his head and said that in all these years, the only person Fan Xian could trust was Uncle Wu Zhu. The old man opened his eyes slightly and said quietly that Mr. Wu Zhu clearly deserved it. The boy smiled and looked warmly at his teacher, telling him that now there was another such person. Fei Jai shuddered and bulged his eyes in extreme surprise. A slightly ruddy young gentleman named Fan Zion told teacher Fei Jai not to forget that one naughty student would always be welcome in Danzhou. The white-haired man looked warmly at the little gentleman and smiled, telling the boy that even if he wanted to forget, he still couldn't. Suddenly the old man remembered something and began to rummage in the pockets of his clothes. Then he held out a brown belt badge with golden patterns and hieroglyphs of the Commissioner of Inspection. The man said that he was asked to give this belt badge to the boy. He asked in surprise, picking up this badge. After a little consideration, a boy named Fan Zion said that it was very honorable. Old man Fei Jai smiled and said that Fan Zion's mother had once given this badge to them for safekeeping, so it rightfully belonged to Fan Zion. Then the dark-haired boy said that he also had a gift for the old man. He took out transparent gloves made of sheep intestines and handed them to the poison master, telling the gray-haired man not to forget to take them with him when he dissects corpses and experiments with all sorts of various poisons. The man immediately took the gloves from the boy's small hands and tried them on. After examining the gloves, he said that he liked them very much. Then the old man Fei Jai got on the horse, and Fan Zion remained standing next to him. Already sitting on the horse, Fei Jai said that if he had met this boy earlier, Fei Jai would have chosen a different path. He would have married someone and raised this young gentleman to be a complete asshole. After saying these words, old man Fei Jai set off on his brown horse. Little Fan Zion shouted to him one last time that his teacher would be able to count on Fan Zion in the future. Hearing these words, Fei Jai shuddered in horror. In his opinion, the words of this boy sounded both cute and scary. Little Fan Zion was smiling and waving goodbye to him. After some time, Fan Zion was sitting in Mr. Wu Zhu's shop, drinking wine. Wu Zhu himself, at this time, finely chopped radish while cooking something. Fan Zion asked his uncle why he didn't drink. Already all rosy and relaxed, Fan Zion told his uncle that he had bought this wine especially for him. However, since he doesn't want to drink it, this kid decided to drink it himself. Uncle Wu Zhu briefly replied that children should not drink alcohol. Already very drunk, Fan Zion continued to drink wine from a clay bowl, telling his uncle that, actually, for his information, the boy wanted to ask Zhu about a lot. Fan Zion then began to inundate the silent Uncle Wu Zhu with various questions. Why has Zhu's appearance not changed a bit in so many years? The boy said that teacher Fei said that Uncle Wu Zhu had no equal in martial arts even among the 4 great masters. Fan Zion wondered if it was true. He also asked what kind of person his mother was. How did Uncle Wu Zhu have wine bowls if he doesn't drink at all? The young gentleman was very interested in who was cooler, Uncle Wu Zhu or teacher Fei Jai. Uncle Wu Zhu was silent and did not answer any questions. After drinking enough, little Fan Zion called his uncle. He began to gradually turn off, and the wine from the bowl was pouring past. The last thing he saw before falling into a drunken sleep was the outline of the figure of Uncle Wu Zhu, who was cooking something. After some time, the little gentleman, still drunk, woke up in a bamboo forest from the scorching sun. Standing next to him was the calm but strict Uncle Wu Zhu. Standing up, the boy began to cough violently and very loudly. He held onto his sternum, saying that he was very ill. The boy did not understand at all what was wrong with him. Blind Wu Zhu calmly replied to him, saying that after Fan Zion brazenly got drunk last night, his inner Kai energy raged violently inside his little body. The boy continued to cough and sigh, slowly getting up on his wobbly legs. The boy's face was still ruddy and very drunk. Little Fan Zion raised his eyebrows and said that Uncle Wu Zhu had given the boy that book, so he should be able to control this Kai energy. Then the young and ruddy drunk asked to teach him how to control the Kai energy in him. He replied in a calm voice that he had already said that he could not teach this. Remembering this, Fan Zion shouted, asking Zhu about what they should do now. Then Uncle Wu Zhu reported that he had another way that could help Fan Xiang. The excited kid asked the blind man what kind of method it was. He picked up a sword and, with a serious face, said that he would beat Fan Zion. The child raised his dark eyebrows in surprise and asked what would happen next. Wu Zhu told Fan Xiang to run. He froze for a second, looking at his uncle with a strange look. Then, in a panic, he grabbed his face and began to shout, as if asking why Uncle Wu Zhu and teacher Fei were bullying him all the time. Wu Zhu calmly informed the young master that he needed to use up his internal energy as soon as possible. Otherwise, Fan Zion would burst, as it was said earlier. Hearing this, the young master froze in horror. Cold sweat was running down his face, and his eyes and mouth were wide open due to shock. Wu Zhu squatted down in the right position and told Fan Xiang to direct his inner Kai energy to his feet, because that's how the boy would be able to increase his speed. Then he abruptly jumped high into the sky. Coming out of his stupor, little Fan Xian gradually began to channel his golden inner Kai energy into his legs, at the same time shouting to Uncle Wu Zhu to wait for him. When the energy reached the young master's legs, he quickly ran after the blind uncle named Wu Zhu. The man with the black blindfold, though blind, was moving very fast. He really had no equal in martial arts. From the outside, it seemed that Wu Zhu was floating in the air, and Fan Xian was running like a horse at a race. The boy smiled, thinking that, as it turned out, his inner Kai energy could be used in a similar way. It turns out that if Fan Xian ran for a long time, he would be able to avoid the explosion. These thoughts distracted the boy, and he lost his vigilance. Suddenly Wu Zhu was next to the boy and gave him a strong slap in the face. Fan Xian's cheek turned very red, and he himself landed in a cool lake, splashing the purest water around. The boy emerged from the lake, holding his red, sore cheek. Frightened fish were swimming around the dark-haired gentleman, and one of them was completely on the head of this obnoxious boy. Fan Xian, in shock and with tears in his eyes, rubbed his sore cheek with a small hand, shouting to the blind Wu Zhu the question of why his uncle hit him. The latter, as always, calmly said that running alone would not be enough, but it was also necessary to have sharp eyesight and quick reaction, since it was then that others would not be able to harm Fan Xian. Cold water from the lake was flowing all over the boy's body. He smiled slyly, wiping the drops from his face, and asked Uncle Wu Zhu about whether he really accused him that Fan Xian was not good enough. He briefly agreed. Suddenly, the boy jumped out of the lake and ran through the bamboo forest again. The water wedge that had risen due to such a sudden start in the lake did not subside in any way. After standing for a few seconds, the blind Uncle Wu Zhu, who had a black cloth bandage over his eyes, ran across the lake after the boy, leaving the same splashes of a water wedge. The fish of this lake and other inhabitants were clearly terrified. Fan Xian continued to concentrate his inner golden Kai energy in his legs, accelerating even more. Sweat from such physical exertion flowed down from the young gentleman's face in a hail. The boy, while running, thought about the fact that, as it turned out, thanks to the concentration of his strength in his legs, Fan Xian could run faster. Running up to the end of the bamboo forest, the boy decided that if he could run out of the forest, then he could also avoid Uncle Wu Zhu's attacks. After reaching the end, Fan Xian jumped off the cliff, taking off with the birds soaring in the sky, thanks to the concentration of internal energy in his legs. He cast a light and sly glance back, thinking that he had run so far that his uncle named Wu Zhu would never catch up with the young master now. However, it was not there. Suddenly Wu Zhu was behind the boy, also hovering in the air like a bird. The boy froze in horror. What? How did it happen at all? The blind Uncle Wu Zhu attacked the cunning boy in the back, and he, leaving dust from himself, began to fall down. Fan Xian landed, clearly destroying the ground beneath him. A huge ball of dust remained from his landing. Uncle Wu Zhu landed gracefully and, moreover, as in silently. Fan Xian was lying on the ground in the pose of a star and crying, not understanding why everything turned out this way. The boy shouted very loudly to the whole forest that Teacher Fei had just left. But a new monster immediately came in his place. Besides, this monster was even worse. From the way Fan Xian landed on the ground, the entire lawn in the forest was stirred up. In addition, there was now a small pit on the bare ground. Fan Xian slowly tried to stand up while Wu Zhu just stood next to him. Then he set conditions for the boy, which consisted in the fact that if he could hit his uncle or even touch his clothes, Fan Xian would be able to consider that he had passed the test. He chuckled, rubbing his hand across his face. Fan Xian suddenly attacked his uncle, telling him that he agreed. However, Uncle Wu Zhu had to definitely keep his word. The boy drew his eyebrows together in inspiration, concentrating his golden inner Kai energy in his small fist. He was smiling, shouting to the man with the black blindfold that he still had plenty of Kai energy. The boy also warned his uncle that he was not going to hurt him at all, but only touch his clothes. Also, suddenly, a boy named Fan Xian flew into a stone, breaking a couple of adult bamboo seedlings along the way. Wu Zhu blocked the boy's attack with one punch with his fist. He gradually slid off the stone, leaving behind an imprinted trace. Besides, even with a face, Fan Xian did not sit still for a long time. He abruptly grabbed a stick of broken bamboo and, shouting demands to try again, attacked the man again. He remained standing in place and did not even move. Fan Xian, at the age of 5, could not resist Uncle Wu Zhu and hit himself on a bamboo stick. The boy was clearly in a lot of pain. At the age of 9, although the boy named Fan Xian became taller and the bamboo stick in his hands was longer, but he was still small and not at all equal to Uncle Wu Zhu. So far, Wu Zhu practically didn't even need to move. He only occasionally beat his student. Fan Xian really didn't like getting slapped in the face. The cheeks were always bright red and sore. He asked his uncle not to do that. After the young gentleman turned 13, he clearly became more confident. The dark-haired boy had grown a little taller and he was picking up a bamboo stick longer. Even in winter, when it snowed, he moved fast. Fan Xian even made Uncle Wu Zhu move. Although he couldn't even touch his clothes, the young master was already able to make a blind man in a black blindfold defend himself using his sword. The movements were fast and well honed. At the age of 16, there were practically no such obvious beatings on the young gentleman, only small abrasions. Even when the guy received quite strong blows from his uncle named Wu Zhu, he no longer flew into a knockout, but could adequately stop and continue the fight. A young man named Fan Xian rolled over like a sausage and hid behind a stone, holding a small stone in his hand and smiling slyly. Then he threw this little pebble to distract his blind uncle. The latter, sensing the movement, turned to this stone. Suddenly, Fan Xian tried to attack from behind, swinging a large bamboo stick that was in his hands. Fan Xian smiled slyly and uttered the phrase in his head, "Get it." However, in less than a second, Fan Xian was hit hard in the face from the feet of the imperturbable Uncle Wu Zhu. The young gentleman, like a bouncing ball, flew to the side, leaving behind a hole in the ground and clouds of dust. The guy, with swollen cheeks, was lying on the ground and did not move. He asked his uncle if it was possible to treat the guy easier, at least with a face. Tears sprang out of Fan Xian's eyes again, just like when the boy was only 5 years old. Mr. Wu Zhu slowly walked up to the guy and hovered over him, creating a shadow. He briefly and clearly informed the young gentleman that the result of the training was counted. Fan Xian immediately got to his feet in shock and said that he had never been able to defeat his uncle. He calmly replied that the young man was now strong enough, so their training was over. Fan Xian replied with a firm refusal. Wu Zhu, though he didn't show it, was clearly surprised. Fan Xian's dark hair fluttered fantastically in the wind. The young man pulled his dark eyebrows to the bridge of his nose and put his hand on his chest. The face of this grown-up guy expressed the most real seriousness. Covered in reddish abrasions and scratches, Fan Xian informed his uncle Wu Zhu that he did not need any credit. The young man said that he would like to continue the fight. Wu Zhu didn't even move an eyebrow at such a statement. A few seconds later, Fan Xian was stuck in the ground with his face and his ass to the top, like an ostrich. Uncle Wu Zhu briefly replied to the young man that he had done everything as the guy wanted. Fan Xian stayed in the ground and cursed loudly with bad words. In the evening, closer to night, the seals on the roof gave each other a relaxing massage. A partially undressed Fan Xian was sitting on the bed in his chambers with a grown-up pink-haired maid named Liu Zai Zai. She, all rosy, was kneading the young man's shoulders. He sometimes oohed and awed, as he had been beaten up by Mr. Wu Zhu the day before. A drop of cold sweat was running down the girl's face. She was excited that her young master had such wounds on his body. She asked the young man if it was true that Mr. Wu Zhu's blows were clearly not a joke. She was worried about it, since the master was still so young. The beaten Fan Xian smiled sweetly while the girl gave him a massage. The young man told the pink-haired maid that he felt all this when he was still a child. However, after many years, when Fan Xian noticed the changes in his body, he finally understood some things. A young gentleman named Fan Xian began to beat his chest and quoted Uncle Wu Zhu's words that squatting is laying the foundation, and slicing carrots is training the mind. Beating Fan Xian was to train vision and reaction, and it was also a training of the fighting instinct. The girl stopped in fright. Fan Xian stretched out his hand and told Liu Zai Zai that Uncle Wu Zhu was beating him for his own good. Liu Zai Zai covered her mouth with her hand in shock. She was thinking that, apparently, the young gentleman had been beaten off the last brains. The young man looked at his hand carefully and said that Uncle Wu Zhu had told him that it was all nothing. The guy clenched his fist tightly, concentrating some Kai energy in it. He then said that Uncle Wu Zhu had told him that the real danger was the Red Robe Knight. The girl looked at her master in surprise and asked about the real danger. Suddenly, the young man grabbed the girl, blushing with embarrassment, by the hand and put her on his lap, saying that she should forget it. Fan Xian decided not to talk about it, but to ask Liu Zai Zai that, is it possible for them to spoil such a good day with such stupid conversations? Liu Zai Zai was all embarrassed and, calling the young gentleman, asked him what he was talking about at all. The young man hovered over the girl, telling her that today he decided to tell her a story about ghosts, which was called Do You Have Legs? The next day, as usual, Fan Xian devoted the morning to his training. Sighing after another exercise, he heard the sound of hooves. The young man tensed and pulled his dark eyebrows to the bridge of his nose. Were they horses? The young gentleman heard the hoofbeats of obviously several horses. He glanced at the gate of his house, thinking that it looked like a whole squad was approaching and there were clearly not a few people in it. He ran to the gate and abruptly opened it. Fan Xian froze and even opened his mouth slightly when he saw the squad in front of him. They were knights in red robes. The guy's eyebrows moved to the bridge of his nose even more. The red-robed guards dismounted from their horses and knelt right in front of the young gentleman named Fan Xian. One of these red-robed guards reported that on Mr. Fan Xian's orders, he had to return to the capital. The young man's eyes bulged in shock and asked again, "What? Return to the capital?" At this time, Grandma Fan was sitting in her chambers and cut out various figures from red paper. Being in shock, Fan Xian immediately ran to his grandmother with loud cries that there were some people in red clothes at the gate who came to take Fan Xian to the capital. She closed her eyes and calmly said that she had already given up on this idea, since, in her opinion, the capital was not the best place for the young master to live, because Fan Xian's mother died there. His grandmother believed that his mother would have lived longer if she had stayed in Danzhou. After listening to the grandmother, Fan Xian pointed to the door and said that all these people in red clothes were kneeling, as if insisting that the young master had to leave Danzhou for the capital, to which his grandmother told him that it was good that they were standing there. Then she added that, "Let them stand like that until they die." From admiration, the young man's eyes lit up with a bright light, and stars appeared instead of pupils. Fan Xian thought that his grandmother was a really cool woman. Then the guy ran back, finally waving his hand and telling his grandmother that he understood everything. An elderly woman, at this moment, made an incision on the paper with scissors. Looking at the paper, she sighed because she had been distracted earlier. Granny Fan looked at the paper and realized that she had cut it off in the wrong place. Fan Xian swiftly sliced white carrots with 2 large cleavers. The young man did it very skillfully. The white carrots were cut very finely, evenly and thinly. While the young master was engaged in fine slicing this very white carrot, Wu Zhu sat near the door and breathed fresh air. At one point, when both men were silent, Fan Xian could not stand it and broke the silence. He turned to Uncle Wu Zhu and said that the young master had been tormented by only one question lately, to which the man with a black blindfold immediately replied to the dark-haired guy that it was up to him to go or not to go to the capital. The young man, surprised at his uncle's insight, sat down next to him and asked him how he could find out what he wanted to ask. Wu Zhu remained silent. Fan Xian had no choice but to overwhelm his uncle with a huge number of questions. He was asking why those red-robed guards were so eager to take the young master to the capital. Fan Xian, on the one hand, would like to leave and tell the capital, but on the other hand, he was also a little apprehensive. Fan Xian then reminded Uncle Wu Zhu that he had told him that his mother had died in the capital. The dark-haired guy was interested in the fact that the person who killed her was still in the capital or not anymore. Then the young man reminded Uncle Wu Zhu that he had said that if Fan Xian ran into danger, then the young man did not have time to finish. Wu Zhu replied to him with lightning speed that he would definitely go with the young master. Fan Xian raised his eyebrows in surprise and asked Uncle Wu Zhu again. He repeated again that he would go with Fan Xian to the capital. Then the young man sighed heavily. After a short silence, he turned back to Mr. Wu Zhu and told him that there was something else Fan Xian wanted to ask Zhu about a long time ago. The latter asked him what he wanted to ask. The young master raised his eyebrows and made a thoughtful face, asking Uncle Wu Zhu that when the young master turns 80 years old, will Uncle Wu Zhu's face remain the same? He didn't make a sound again. Returning back to her room, the maid called Fan Xian to have lunch. He walked with Liu Zai to the table, where another servant was waiting for him. The table was covered with various goodies: tofu, baked chicken, mushroom soup, seafood, and bamboo shoots. Sitting down at the table, the young man asked why his grandmother did not come to lunch. A servant in a turquoise outfit bowed slightly and said that the lady was keen on reading, so she asked her grandson named Fan Xian to have lunch alone. The young gentleman, armed with wooden chopsticks and a spoon, began to eat. He scooped up a spoonful of mushroom soup, then quite a bit of bamboo shoots, a piece of seafood, a very small piece of chicken. After chewing on this modest lunch, Fan Xian grabbed a plate with bamboo shoots in his hands and said that it was a very tasty dish that he liked. The guy abruptly got up from the table and said that he would finish these bamboo shoots in his room. The servant in the turquoise outfit opened his mouth in shock and froze. Then he clarified that Fan Xian would really take only one plate with him. He asked what he should do with the others. The young man, quickly leaving with his pink-haired maid named Liu Zai, told them, as usual, to just eat everything. When the servant and the maid were left alone, He cursed and whispered contemptuously that even if this illegitimate child did not follow the rules, he still looked like a master. The blonde maid looked at the remaining dishes and said that according to custom, servants could only eat what their master left them. However, this young gentleman only tasted a piece of each dish. The maid thought it was too arrogant an act. The male servant arched an eyebrow and pouted, agreeing with the woman. He sincerely did not understand why the lady loved this young gentleman named Fan Xian so much. Then he invited the blonde maid to share the leftovers with all the other servants. She nodded. At this time, Fan Xian was walking very quickly into the room, holding a plate with bamboo shoots in his hands. Liu Zai excitedly ran after him, asking her master what had happened. He reported with all seriousness and severity that he had been poisoned. A pink-haired maid named Liu Zai cried out in shock, surprised that someone dared to poison the young master. Cold sweat trickled down Fan Xian's face. He looked at the plate with green bamboo shoots and said that it was this dish that someone had poisoned. Fan Xian thought to himself that he always tasted the dishes before letting grandma and all the servants touch the food. The young man did this in order to avoid such a case, where his grandmother and servants would be poisoned. A young gentleman named Fan Xian ran into the room, opened a drawer of a wooden chest of drawers and took a paper bag from there. Opening it, Fan Xian poured the powder into his mouth and swallowed. And then the young man, just a couple of moments later, threw up on this wooden chest of drawers. Liu Zai was terribly worried and stroked her master's back while he was sick. When he was done, Fan Xian wiped his mouth with the sleeve of his robes. A maid named Liu Zai, already all red with excitement, crying loudly, told her master, choking with tears, that Fan Xian had to get better. Then the girl announced, crying even louder, that she would not survive if something happened to the young master. Just a second later, Fan Xian leveled up and grinned. Cold sweat was still running down his face. The girl looked at her master in shock. The maid named Liu Zai didn't understand how he came to his senses so quickly. He immediately reported that there was not much poison in this dish, so everything is fine with him. To himself, the young man thought about this poison. This poison was called cat button. It was often used by spies from the Observer Council. Malcusi was a fruit from the southern islands, the juice of which did not manifest itself when mixed with other products. In addition, Malcusi was extremely difficult to detect. That is why spies were often used to commit murders that needed to be hidden. After this poison from the juice of the Malcusi fruit got into the stomach, it immediately began to act, causing convulsions and death in people. In addition, it was almost impossible to determine the causes of death in such cases. This poison itself from the juice of the Malcusi fruit had a faint taste. The only drawback of this poison was its slightly bitter tint. Fan Xian concluded that the killer must have known about it, so he mixed this poison with bamboo shoots. Apparently, this killer was clearly well versed in various poisons. However, the young gentleman was confused by the fact that the dose of this poison from the juice of the Malcusi fruit was clearly not fatal. The only thing that could be is simple diarrhea. Who could have done this? Fan Xian looked at his maid named Liu Zai and asked her if she knew, by chance, where they got these bamboo shoots from. The girl scratched her chin thoughtfully and reported that Lao Ha's nephew had brought these bamboo shoots to their kitchen this morning. Fan Xian frowned thoughtfully, asking the pink-haired Liu Zai that, wasn't it usually Lao Ha himself who did this? The young gentleman was interested in why his nephew suddenly replaced him today. Liu Zai naively looked at her master and reported that the other servants said that Lao Ha was ill, so his nephew was doing the delivery today. Then she asked Fan Xian if something was wrong. Fan Xian scratched his chin thoughtfully. Frowning, he began to analyze the information he had heard earlier. The young man was confused by the fact that today's deliverer of bamboo shoots was called Lao Ha's nephew. As far as Fan Xian knew, Lao Ha was lonely. Where did his nephew come from? Fan Xian concluded that this nephew was supposed to be the real killer. Poisoned, but not killed. The young man did not know what this killer was up to. What kind of games did he play? Coming out of his thoughts, Fan Xian quickly walked outside. An excited maid named Liu Zai ran after him, asking about where the guy was going. Then she asked her master if he was feeling better and then offered to call a doctor. Fan Xian stopped and turned to the pink-haired girl, lightly hugging her. He convinced her that everything was fine with him, so he would leave for a while. The girl resolutely stated that, in that case, CC would go with him. The guy turned around and walked briskly again, throwing his maid a final word that it could be dangerous there, which is why the lovely maid Liu Zai should have stayed at home. Fan Xian walked resolutely towards Lao Ha's house. He was thinking that since the young man himself could not figure it out, he decided to just go and ask Lao Ha about it personally. Fan Zion really wanted to see who the killer was. The young gentleman wanted to know why he was doing this. Fan Zion ran very fast to Lao Ha's house. Practically approaching this house, the young man froze, scouting the situation with his weapon in his hands. Seeing the bound Mr. Lao Ha, the guy frowned. He was thinking that, apparently, the killer wanted to get rid of this man named Lao Ha. The young man decided that, to begin with, he should have saved the man, and then asked about everything. A young gentleman named Fan Zion was walking quickly to meet Lao Ha, along the way telling him that he had come to save the man. Having almost untied and removed the cloth gag from the man's mouth, Fan Zion sternly asked him about who could have done this to this man. He started coughing and then shouted, warning the young master about something behind him. Sensing movement behind him, the young gentleman named Fan Zion froze for a second, narrowing his eyes. Behind him, a man in dark clothes and a blue patterned tattoo practically attacked Fan Zion with his blade. The young man took his sword out of its scabbard with lightning speed and blocked the man's attack, so that even the energy concentrated in the sword collapsed into a small fiery explosion upon impact. The assassin bulged his eyes and tried to attack Fan Zion again. However, he bit his lip hard and also repelled the attack with lightning speed. The man with the blade flew to the side. At this time, Lao Ha finally freed himself from the ropes. Fan Zion lowered his sword and sternly looked at the mercenary with the blade, asking him if he was responsible for poisoning the bamboo shoots prepared for the young master. A dark-haired man with a scar on his nose named Teng Zijing stopped and grunted when he heard Fan Zion's question. However, he then attacked the youth again. A white-haired man named Lao Ha, shouting, raised his hands up when Teng Zijing began to approach them. The elderly man was really very scared. When Teng Zijing almost attacked the dark-haired youth, he put his hand forward and forced him to stop. He immediately stopped and waited in silence. Meanwhile, after making sure that the scarred man had stopped, the young master took Lao Ha aside and told him to stand further away. He obediently walked away. Chuckling, Fan Zion smiled and then swung his sharp metal sword, telling Teng Zijing that now the young man could teach this man with a scar on his nose a good lesson. He grunted again and took out a bunch of small throwing knives, attacking the young man. He gritted his teeth and said through them that Fan Zion was too soft and sentimental. Then he accurately threw a bunch of these knives in the direction of the young man. The throwing knives were filled with Zijing's purple energy, which even sparkled at their tips. However, even though the attack was a mark, Fan Zion was able to block this attack with ease, fighting off a pile of knives with his sword alone. The dark-haired young master quickly ran towards Teng Zijing and attacked him with his sword filled with his bright blue inner Kai energy. The man named Teng Zijing rolled head over heels to the side, again attacking the young gentleman named Fan Zion with a bunch of his throwing blades. They, filled with bright purple energy, flew aptly towards Fan Zion again. The young man miraculously managed to dodge them, not understanding where this man got so many of these knives. Teng Zijing took out another portion of these sharp knives again and very quickly directed them towards the young man. Fan Zion, terrified, sweating all over, looked at Zijing and asked him that, was it really not the end? The guy wondered if this Teng Zijing was even a person. Fan Zion had no other choice. He jumped and galloped around Lao Ha's courtyard, dodging fast blades. First he jumped on wooden boxes, and then he ran along the wooden wall of Lao Ha's house, and then he dodged those sharp knives again. Fan Zion and Teng Zijing fought fiercely, not yielding to each other. This was observed by a blind man named Wu Zhu, whom Fan Zion called uncle. He did not get into the fight at all, but only watched, sitting on the roof of a wooden building. Teng Zijing fought with his sharp blade with Fan Zion, splashing his bright purple Kai energy. However, Fan Zion was also not inferior to him, attacking the man with the scar on his nose with his sharp sword, splashing his bright blue Kai energy, so they could fight until they were completely exhausted. However, Fan Zion was very cunning. He jumped over Teng Zijing and ended up behind him. This allowed the man with the scar on his nose to hesitate for a second. He turned and attacked the young man with his bright purple-tipped blade with lightning speed. Fan Zion was also not amiss and immediately attacked with lightning speed in response. They grappled with their sharp metal weapons, splashing each other's bright Kai energies. Then the men parted, and then completely sat down on the ground. Teng Zijing wounded the young master in the shoulder. The guy, holding onto his shoulder, asked the dark-haired mercenary that, did he put poison on his sharp dagger? Drops of cold sweat dripped down the serious guy's face, and the clothes on his shoulder began to gradually turn scarlet. Teng Zijing gripped his dagger tightly in his hands, briefly replying to the young master that he had lost. Then the man with the scar on his nose leveled off and began to slowly approach the guy, telling him that Teng Zijing did not expect that at such a young age Fan Zion possessed such strength. Then he said he was sorry the guy missed the kick. Fan Xian continued to sit on the ground with his back to him, holding on to his injured arm. Then Tang Zijing said that the poison in the food should make people unable to move, but the poison applied on the dagger should have killed the guy. Fan Xian frowned and turned around slightly, telling the man with the scar on his nose that he would keep this in mind. Tang Zijing looked closely at Fan Xian and said that the murderers were all cruel because that was the way it was. Fan Xian leaned forward slightly and exhaled, trying to stifle a chuckle. The latter looked at him in surprise and asked why Fan Xian was laughing. A young gentleman named Fan Xian turned to a dark-haired mercenary and asked that, hadn't this guy ever heard that villains die from talking too much? Tang Zijing opened his eyes in shock and opened his mouth slightly, asking the young man again. Then he began to back away. The dagger fell out of the hands of this man with a scar on his nose. His legs stopped holding him, and Tang Zijing collapsed to the ground, trembling. He was terrified and trembling all over, asking the young dark-haired gentleman about whether his sword was also poisoned. At this time, Fan Xian leveled up and, unable to restrain a grin, began to shake off his clothes, while Tang Zijing realized that he too was under the influence of poison. Then the youth named Fan Xian turned around, smiling eerily. He informed Tang Zijing that this young gentleman had been stuffed with various poisons since childhood, so it was impossible to take him with such a simple poison. Fan Xian placed his sword on Tang Zijing's shoulder with lightning speed. He shuddered in horror. The young gentleman looked down at the dark-haired mercenary. His gaze was filled with severity and seriousness. Fan Xian then told Tang Zijing to talk about what his goal was. Fan Xian, holding his sharp, moreover poisoned sword on Tang Zijing's shoulder, continued to question him about the purpose of these actions. The young man was interested in why this man with a scar on his nose poisoned his food. Besides, if Tang Zijing really poisoned her, then why did he use a non-lethal dose? Tang Zijing, breathing heavily, through a confused breath, informed the young man that he only wanted to kill him. Besides, Tang Zijing did not want to involve the others in this matter. Fan Xian, without taking his stern gaze off the dark-haired hired killer, asked him about whether such mercy was characteristic of murderers. The guy was also interested in who sent Tang Zijing to kill him. The man with the scar on his nose straightened up and firmly replied that it was a secret order of the inspection, namely, the murder of a traitor. Fan Xian couldn't contain his shock and cried out, surprised that he was considered a traitor. Tang Zijing shouted and, firmly standing on his own, said that even if he died, someone else would replace him in any case. He also said that no one, even if they wanted to, would be able to save the person the inspection was hunting. Fan Xian might still be breathing, but in the eyes of these inspection guys, he was already dead a long time ago. Fan Xian put his sword aside and quickly took out the golden badge that teacher Fei Jai had given him as a child. Seeing the badge, Tang Zijing opened his mouth in shock. Fan Xian, continuing to stare sternly at the man with the scar on his nose, said that Fei Jai from the 3rd Department of the Inspection Institute was his teacher. Tang Zijing found it harder to restrain his composure from shock. He, bypassing the norms of decency, immediately asked the dark-haired guy that Fei Jai really was his teacher. Fan Xian, continuing to hold this polished gold badge, told Tang Zijing that the young gentleman was 16 years old at the moment, and in childhood he lost his mother. In addition, since Fan Xian was an illegitimate child, the young gentleman had never seen his father and the dark-haired guy had lived here in Danzhou all his life. Fan Xian bent down and looked into Tang Zijing's eyes, asking him that with his life experience, the young man would have time to earn the status of a traitor. The latter, moving away from the shock for some time and digesting the information received, was silent, his mouth slightly open. Then the man with the scar on his nose said that everything Fan Xian had said earlier made sense. He looked seriously at the hired killer again and asked about what had happened to him and the guys from the inspection. Tang Zijing was silent again for a while. Then, moving away from his deep thoughts, he said that he had understood everything, as it seemed to him. Someone gave a false order to eliminate Fan Xian. The young master suddenly dropped his sword and abruptly walked to the side. Sweat trickled down the face of the man with the scar on his nose. He tensed up and asked Fan Xian if he would really not kill him, to which the serious guy said that they had a big misunderstanding, so why would Fan Xian kill him? Tang Zijing suddenly announced loudly that since someone wanted to remove the young gentleman, and Tang Zijing's attempt failed, then, most likely, other hired assassins will appear who will try to silence this man with a scar on his nose. To which Fan Xian closed his eyes and calmly replied that it had absolutely nothing to do with the young master in any way. Then Fan Xian suddenly stopped and said that he had another question for Tang Zijing. The guy explained that their rules were very strict. The question was how Tang Zijing could pass for Lao Ha's nephew by appearing on Fan Xian's doorstep just once. Fan Xian turned around and looked at the assassin with a creepy look, asking him about who helped this man with a scar on his nose with documents. Tang Zijing was covered in cold sweat, feeling Fan Xian's creepy gaze on him. He, not even daring to look the young gentleman in the eye, stammered that their farm manager had helped him with the documents. After a while, the manager of the household, tied with a rope, sobbed, trying to justify himself by saying that if he had not helped Tang Zijing with the documents, they would have killed everyone else, and not as promised, only Fan Xian. He choked with tears, justifying himself by saying that he really did not want the others to suffer. Then he bowed and told the lady that he had done all this for their family. An elderly woman, meanwhile, silently listened, holding a white clay bowl with a lid in her hands, to the excuses of the farm manager. Then she opened her blue eyes and began to drill into the man with a creepy look, telling him that since it was for the sake of the family, she was ready to listen. Then the manager of the household loudly announced that he had been sent by the second mistress to look after Fan Xiang. The manager believed that if this guy went to the capital, he would definitely start litigation over the family property. The manager began to shed tears again, saying that, in order to avoid this, it would be easier for the young gentleman to forbid him to appear in the capital for the rest of his days. Banging the bowl on the table, Grandma Fan stood up, holding onto a wooden stick, and said that it was all very logical. Besides, for the sake of the stability of the Fan family, soft-heartedness had to be discarded. Fan Xian, meanwhile, was slightly surprised, listening attentively to his grandmother, and froze. After a few seconds, he realized what his grandmother had said and went cold with shock. The guy was extremely surprised that his grandmother agreed with the words of the farm manager. Then the elderly woman turned around and sternly, even coldly, looked at her grandson, telling him that Xian should remember that, with age, it was necessary to learn to be ruthless. After these words, the elderly woman ordered the other servants to come to her chambers. 2 men immediately entered the elderly lady's room. Fan Xian shuddered, excitedly asking his grandmother about what she was up to. The manager of the household, meanwhile, stopped sobbing and pouring bitter tears. He even smiled and grinned, telling his mistress about how wise she was. However, suddenly Granny Fan touched the manager's shoulder with a wooden stick. He froze in surprise. The elderly woman looked coldly at the manager of the household and ordered the other servants to break his legs and put him in a boat, and, moreover, so that the manager could not set foot on land until his last breath. The manager made a sound of surprise. The servants grabbed the manager and carried him out of the room. He screamed and struggled. He shouted the word no and constantly called the mistress. However, she was clearly adamant. Already at the door, the manager of the household shouted to the mistress in the back that, didn't she say that she couldn't stand this kid named Fan Xian? Was it all a lie? Listening to this, the young gentleman stood quietly and was silent. After some time, the lady broke the silence and asked her grandson about what Fan Xian himself was thinking. He, without expressing emotions at all, said in a calm voice that after all, another lady sent him gifts during the holidays. The young gentleman was so pleased to receive such tokens of attention. The elderly woman said that, even with all this, they did not know whether the words of the farm manager were true. Then she said that she would write to Fan Xian's father and ask for an inspection. The young gentleman straightened up and called his grandmother in a serious tone, telling her that it was not worth doing this, since he decided to find out everything on his own. She, in shock, opened her eyes wide and asked the young man about whether he really decided to go to the capital. Then she asked about the fact that, hadn't the two of them agreed that Fan Xian would stay here in Danzhou? The young gentleman blushed slightly and smiled warmly, telling his grandmother that, as she herself saw perfectly well, the young man had grown up, but he had not really seen anything in the world. Then he pulled his dark eyebrows to the bridge of his nose and looked away, saying that since there was the first killer, there will be a second one. Instead of hiding, Fan Xian could have gone there himself. Grandma Fan asked if her grandson had made a decision for sure. He agreed and then said that he would definitely return back to Danzhou when everything was fine. The elderly woman sighed heavily and said that, in any case, there were problems that needed to be solved. Then she asked when the young master decided to go to the capital. He lowered his gaze, announcing that he would go to the capital tomorrow. The elderly lady turned away and said that she would not come out tomorrow to see off her grandson, as she was getting old and did not like to say goodbye. Fan Xian looked at her with a sad look and was silent. On the same day, in the bamboo forest near the lake, Fan Xian sat on the shore and watched the bamboo leaves fall on the water surface. Tang Zijing stood next to him with his hands folded in front of him. Then the man with the scar on his nose broke their silence and asked Fan Xian if he could ask the young man for a favor. The young gentleman glanced at him briefly and asked what kind of service he had asked of him. Tang Zijing looked away with his cold gaze and asked Fan Ziyan to kill him. Fan Ziyan, hearing this strange request for a favor, raised his dark eyebrows and asked Tang Zijing again. What? Kill him? The man with the scar on his nose silently looked into the distance and waited. After a few moments, during which Fan Ziyan was absorbed in his thoughts, he finally spoke up, already asking Tang Zijing that he, as the young man assumed, meant to help an assassin hide his identity. Fan Ziyan then asked Tang Zijing that he apparently wanted to hide his identity due to the fact that the mercenary with the scar on his nose had to betray his employer earlier. Tang Zijing lowered his gaze and said that he had not betrayed anyone, but he had an important matter that Tang Zijing needed to attend to. Fan Ziyan pointed his thumb at himself and asked him what he would get from this service. Is the offer profitable? Tang Zijing giggled and then looked at Fan Ziyan with a creepy expression, asking the young master about what. Wouldn't he like to know about what tricks the second lady used to mislead the whole inspection institute? Fan Ziyan looked at Tang Zijing as if he was insane, and then told him to speak normally. He was embarrassed and then said that Tang Zijing meant that in this way the investigation of Fan Ziyan would go much faster. Fan Ziyan thought about it and scratched his chin, looking away. After a little thought, he said that this clearly made sense. Then the guy smiled and said that, in that case, he hoped for their fruitful cooperation. After a certain period of time, Fan Ziyan came to, as it turned out, the grocery store of the blind uncle Wu Zhu. A man with a black blindfold was tying small piles of firewood with a rope. Fan Ziyan sat down next to him and leaned his head on his arm. After a short silence, listening to the sounds of ropes and the friction of brushwood, the young man informed his uncle Wu Zhu that he had decided to go to the capital. The latter, not at all distracted from his important business with bundles of brushwood, briefly agreed with the young man's decision. Fan Ziyan was sitting sad and even kind of tired. A lingering and unpleasant longing spread through his body. Then the dark-haired young gentleman told his uncle Wu Zhu that he had been looking after this disobedient boy all these years. The young man was interested in the fact that, didn't Uncle Wu Zhu have things that he would like to do? People that Zhu cared about? Or maybe some plans for the rest of his life? Hearing the boy's words, Wu Zhu immediately asked if Fan Ziyan didn't need him anymore. The young master cried out in shock and horror. Then he began to tremble and worry terribly, saying that he always needed Uncle Wu Zhu. Besides, in Fan Ziyan's opinion, the young man had no one more important and more expensive than Uncle Wu Zhu. He acknowledged and asked about what the young man meant by this. At this time, Wu Zhu picked up a broom and was ready to start sweeping his shop. Fan Ziyan lowered his gaze and told Uncle Wu Zhu that he would go to the capital tomorrow. In addition to all this, he will go to the man who so desired the young man's death. Also, the young gentleman decided to try to find out what happened to his mother. Fan Ziyan thought it was a great option, because he would do what he always wanted to do. Fan Ziyan then turned his stern gaze to Wu Zhu's blind uncle, telling him that Wu Zhu had said last time that he would follow Fan Ziyan to the capital and protect him. However, the dark-haired young man really hoped that Uncle Wu Zhu would finally do what he liked. The young master really wanted his uncle named Wu Zhu to finally start living for himself. The man with the black blindfold pressed his lips together and said nothing. At this time, Fan Ziyan was already at the door. He waved to Tom and said he was going. Then the guy slammed the door loudly, leaving Uncle Wu Zhu alone with his thoughts. He sat in silence for a while, thinking. A man with a black blindfold was shaking his head to the sides, quoting Fan Ziyan's words. Do what you like, live for yourself. Fan Ziyan returned to his quarters after a while, and began to pack his things. He carefully folded his clothes and packed them in brown suitcases. Folding another set of clothes, Fan Ziyan felt quiet footsteps behind him. Then he froze and turned around slightly. Behind the young man stood Uncle Wu Zhu with a black suitcase in his hands. He firmly informed the guy that he had found what he wanted to do. Fan Ziyan, unable to contain his shock, asked his uncle about how he was able to think about everything so quickly. Then blind Wu Zhu took out a black suitcase and put it on the table. All this time, while he was taking it out, carrying it and putting it on the table, the dark-haired young gentleman was looking at this suitcase with interest. In the end, Fan Ziyan put his hands on the black suitcase and did not take his eyes off it. Wu Zhu, meanwhile, said that this black suitcase was left to him by the mistress, that is, Fan Ziyan's mother, and Uncle Wu Zhu would like to finally open it. Then Wu Zhu's uncle lowered his gaze slightly and reported that Fan Ziyan had told him the same thing that Fan Ziyan's mother had once told Wu Zhu. A man with a black blindfold said that Fan Ziyan's mother really wanted Wu Zhu to find something he would really like to do. Listening to the words of the blind Uncle Wu Zhu, the young gentleman examined the black suitcase. Raising his eyebrows, the young man asked how they could open this suitcase. Uncle Wu Zhu calmly reported that in order to open this suitcase, they needed a key to it. Fan Xian turned around and held out his hand for Uncle Wu Zhu to give him the key. However, he shrugged his shoulders and said that he did not have a key. Then Fan Xian knitted his eyebrows to the bridge of his nose and suggested that Uncle Wu Zhu just open this black suitcase, imitating the suitcase and the sword with his hands. Mr. Wu Zhu immediately drew his sword from its scabbard and concentrated his inner bright blue Kai energy into it. He quickly pointed it at the black suitcase and tried to cut it. Fan Xian, not expecting this, stepped aside, terrified. Wu Zhu landed several blows on the black suitcase. A few seconds passed. The suitcase was still intact. However, literally a couple of seconds later, the table on which this suitcase was lying collapsed, collapsing into small pieces. But the suitcase that Fan Xian's mother left at Zhu was unharmed. The young gentleman covered his ears because of the roar. He started shouting, asking Zhu what this black suitcase was made of in the first place. Besides, where did his mom get this suitcase from? Wu Zhu did not know the answer to these questions, which Fan Zhang also reported. Then the young man looked at the man with the black blindfold and asked where, in that case, was the key. He reported that the key was in the capital, so Wu Zhu decided to go with Fan Xiang. The young gentleman chuckled happily and said that, in that case, they would be leaving for the capital tomorrow. Wu Zhu began to leave the young man's chambers, finally telling him that he would go to the capital first and meet Fan Xian there. Then Xian asked about what he should do with this suitcase, to which Wu Zhu told him to just leave him lying on the floor. Fan Xian raised his eyebrows, looking at this black box. He was tormented by a number of questions. What was this box made of? And what kind of things needed such protection? The next day, red-robed guards sat on horses near Fan Xian's house. They were holding big red flags in their hands, waiting for Fan Xian. The young man was heading towards them, holding the same black suitcase in his hands to take him to the capital. He was followed by a maid named Liu Zai Zai, who wanted to escort her young master. Suddenly, the young man stopped and cast a glance to the side. Granny Fan was standing in the middle of a room and looking at her sadly. She was thinking about Fan Xiang. In her opinion, this child had become quite an adult and now had to leave. She was right. However, these thoughts greatly saddened the elderly lady. Suddenly, Fan Xian appeared on the threshold of the room. He called his grandmother, and she started in surprise. Then she turned around and said that she would not accompany her grandson as promised. However, the latter, not listening to his grandmother at all, went up to her and kissed her on the forehead. The elderly woman was stunned and, stammering, asked about what this child was doing at all. Fan Xian smiled and told Grandma to be sure to take care of herself. Besides, the young master promised to come back to pick up his grandmother when he had settled everything. Fan Xian then moved back and sat on his knees. After that, he bowed to the floor to his grandmother. She was smiling warmly. On the smiling face of an elderly woman, tears welled up in her eyes. Fan Xian went out into the courtyard. Guards in red robes, holding red flags in their hands, sat on horses and waited for the young master. Walking to his wooden carriage with a black box in his hands, the young gentleman ordered the guards to go to the capital. Stopping by the wooden carriage, Fan Xian confidently looked up into the gentle blue sky with almost no clouds, and turned to the capital, telling her that he was already on his way. The wooden carriage began to move. Knights in red robes, holding red flags in their hands, rode horses in front. When the carriage started to leave, Liu Zai Zai, all in tears, shouted loudly to Master Fan Xiang, telling him that he had to take care of himself while his maidservant was not around. Fan Xian looked out of the carriage window and, smiling warmly, waved to that pink-haired girl with his hand. Teng Zijing rolled his eyes slightly and wearily asked the young man about why he should not take his little maid with him. Finally tearing himself away from the window, Fan Xian leaned against the wooden wall of the carriage and told Teng Zijing that the guy did not know anything about the capital at all, so he would not want to expose the pink-haired maid named Liu Zai Zai to danger at all. Fan Xian fell silent after these words and thought about when the time would come. The black suitcase, meanwhile, was lying under Xian's seat and waiting in the wings. Towards evening, Fan Xian and all the servants with him decided to make a halt. Then he ordered a fire to be kindled on the bonfire as soon as possible. Xian and his servants were busy setting up the camp, while the guards in red robes, meanwhile, sat beside their horses on the grass and rested. After some time, dinner was prepared. Fan Xian handed a deep bowl to Teng Zijing, who only looked at him strangely. The young gentleman frowned and asked Teng Zijing with displeasure about why he stuck to him. Then the guy reminded the man with the scar on his nose that he was now Fan Xian's servant, and then told him to deliver food. A few moments later, Fan Xian was already sipping soup from his bowl and enjoying the picturesque view of the forest thicket. The guy was sitting on a log and sighing with pleasure. Next to him stood a thoughtful Tang Zijing, who periodically grunted. Fan Xian decided to start a conversation first and asked the former assassin if he knew why Fan Xian suddenly needed his father in the capital. He said that he thought it was quite obvious, since the young man had to prepare for his future role. Fan Xian reminded Tang Zijing that it was just the two of them here. Then he asked why he was hiding something from him. The man with the scar on his nose chuckled and said that the young gentleman was quite a joker. Young Master Fan made a terrible expression on his face and told Tang Zijing that he sometimes had no time for jokes at all. The man with the scar on his nose shuddered in fear. A drop of cold sweat trickled down his face. Fan Xian's expression became peaceful again. The frightened Tang Zijing walked a little forward and cleared his throat, telling the young man that as far as he knew, Fan Xian was being prepared for the wedding. The young master asked his servant again, without expressing any emotions at all. He turned around slightly and said that Fan Xian, if he wanted, could believe or could not believe. However, the 4th Department of the Prosecutor's Office was responsible for espionage and inspections, and the 6th Department of the Prosecutor's Office was responsible for murders. In addition, Tang Zijing was in both departments at once, so he believed that there could be no mistake in his words. Then he said that the prosecutor's office has always acted quickly and decisively. Also, this man noticed that if the people from the 6th Department decide to do something, then Fan Xian will no longer be a tenant. After these words, Tang Zijing imitated the demolition of the head with his hand. Fan Xian, listening to Zijing, thought. He thought that even if the killer was someone from the 6th Division, Uncle Wu Zhu would solve this tricky question in a matter of seconds. Then Fan Xian, holding a plate of food in his hands, asked Tang Zijing about whether he knew who would be the bride of the young master. He looked seriously at his master with his green eyes and said that Fan Xian's fiancée would be the daughter of the prime minister of the current dynasty. Fan Xian opened his mouth in shock and jerked, pouring food from the bowl. The young man was surprised that they wanted to marry him, illegitimate, to the daughter of the prime minister. The guy abruptly stood up and thought, scratching his chin. Something was clearly wrong here. Tang Zijing, closing his eyes, said that Miss Lin's family was extremely virtuous, and her family had a really good reputation in the capital. However, that girl had very poor health. In addition, she had recently become seriously ill, so her family was in a hurry. Fan Xian slammed his fist into his palm, crying out from the realization of what was happening. So that was it. So, it turns out, Fan Xian, something like a lucky charm for the Lin family. Blushing from shock, Tang Zijing pointed his finger at the guy, telling him that the young gentleman, by the way, was going to marry a girl who was about to die. The man with the scar on his nose wondered why the young man's reaction was not angry at all. He spread his arms to the sides and shrugged, closing his eyes. Then he said that there was no use in being angry. On the contrary, Fan Xian sympathized with her, since Miss Lin was forced to marry a man she had never met because of poor health. Tang Zijing folded his hands in front of him and fell silent. The young man asked him in surprise what had happened. The man grinned and said that nothing had happened, it just seemed to him that Fan Xian was different. Suddenly, Fan Xian stuck out his index finger and said that, firstly, his departure to the capital did not mean that he would accept this marriage at all. Then he stuck out his second finger and said that, secondly, if he agreed to the marriage, then the second party should please the young master. Then he put out a third finger, saying that, thirdly, even if this girl was bedridden, the guy didn't see anything wrong with it. Fan Xian frowned and grinned, exposing the fourth finger on his hand. Then he said that, fourthly, Tang Zijing probably did not know, but the young gentleman was not only well versed in all kinds of poisons, but was also an excellent healer. Tang Zijing went to the carriage, finally telling Fan Xian to try. The man with the scar on his nose was wondering how the young master would cope with the disease, which was beyond the power of even imperial doctors. Fan Xian pouted his lips in displeasure and asked Tang Zijing about why he spoke like that. Did he not know at all how a servant was supposed to behave? After finishing the conversation with Tang Zijing, the young man grinned again and thought, scratching his chin. He thought that, in any case, they would live and see everything. Also, the young man was very interested. Miss Lin was pretty. Or maybe Miss Lin is cute. Or maybe this Miss Lin was a lowly. Such pleasant thoughts clearly warmed Fan Xian's soul. 2 months later, they arrived at the stone gates of the capital. An elderly coachman informed a young master named Fan Xian that they had almost arrived at the capital. Fan Xian looked out of the window and opened his mouth in shock, even exclaimed. The capital was gorgeous, so big, beautiful, with burning lanterns and a bunch of people. Even in the evening, the street was very busy. The young man, as if spellbound, looked at the street through the window. Tang Zijing looked at the young master strangely and asked what happened. The latter, without taking his eyes off the window, said that this place was completely different from what Fan Xian thought he would see here. Tang Zijing chuckled and said that the capital was really different from Danzhou. Fan Xian continued to stare out the window in fascination. The bright light of Chinese paper lanterns was reflected in his brown eyes. The young man was smiling. This world seemed quite interesting to him. Meanwhile, a mercenary in dark robes sat bowing to the second lady. He was reporting, with his head tilted down, that the mission to kill Fan Xian had failed. Besides, the young master was on his way to the capital. The woman was silent for a while. Then she said it was good too. A bloody dagger lay at her feet. She grinned and said that all this was gaining interesting momentum. Fan Xian stood surprised and with his mouth slightly open. He looked at the Fan family mansion and marveled at how incredible it was. Going inside, Fan Xian was met by a dark-haired maid with an interesting hairstyle. After bowing, she informed that the owner, Fan Xian's father, was not in the mansion at the moment. In addition, before leaving the mansion, the man ordered to give a warm welcome to the young gentleman. She also said that if Fan Xian needed anything, he could always turn to this maid. The guy smiled and nodded, thinking that it was very unexpected that his father, whom Xian had never met, was so interested in the young man. After some time, Fan Xian followed the maid along the stone road, around which there were clean and beautiful ponds. The young gentleman could not get enough of such beauty. He thought about having such a large residence in the capital, where there was a war for every inch of land. It seemed to the young man that his father really was an extraordinary man. After a while, Fan Xian was already in the corridor of the mansion. An excited servant passed by him. This clearly alerted the young man, but he tried not to attach importance to it. Then the same situation happened with the other two maids. This time, Fan Xian turned around, thinking that the people who met him here on the way deliberately avoided the young man because of his status as illegitimate. Fan Xian clearly didn't care. He was thinking that, shouldn't the father have been ashamed that he had an illegitimate child? When the dark-haired maid escorted the young master to his chambers, she stopped and bowed again, saying that the second lady had asked the young master to come to her when he was settled in his chambers. He nodded and, smiling, replied good. The maid standing in his chambers said that they were waiting for him very much. Then the young man put a black suitcase on the floor and sat down on a chair. After washing and wiping his face with a towel, he put it back in the basin that the maid was holding. Her face, at this moment, expressed shock because of the actions of the young master. Another excited maid asked the young master to follow her. Fan Xian, looking at what was happening, thought again. Yes, the capital was not like Danzhou at all. He realized that his politeness with the servants looked completely out of place here at the Fan residence. When that maid brought the young master to another corridor, she asked him to wait for the second mistress here. He walked along the corridor, thinking that the second lady must not have come yet, so, apparently, the servants were not at all sure whether it was possible to let the guy inside. In that case, the young master could only wait. The young gentleman walked to the fragrant lit incense sticks and leaned on the column next to them, waiting for the second lady. Then he folded his hands in front of him and walked out into the courtyard with a disgruntled face. Everyone was burning incense sticks. Were they also hoping to get rid of the smell of an illegitimate child in their house? In that case, Fan Xian grinned, thinking of something. The maids looked out in terrible shock, examining the young master. Someone opened his mouth, someone covered his face with his hands, wondering. They saw the young master sitting on a wooden chair, waiting for the second lady. What? Did he really do it? The maids were surprised by the impudent behavior of the young master. Fan Xian was sitting on a wooden chair, happy as an elephant. He was quite comfortable. The maids, at this time, whispered that the younger generation had to stand humbly until the arrival of the elders. The girls wondered where the young gentleman had so much pathos. They were afraid of what would happen if the second lady saw this. A few moments later, a second lady named Liu Ruyu, who was the mistress of the mansion and the mother of Fan Ciji, appeared in the corridor. In addition, she was also in charge of all the internal affairs of the Fan mansion. Seeing their mistress, the maids straightened up and bowed to her. The woman came up behind the chair where Fan Xian was sitting with his eyes closed. Feeling the movement, he opened his eyes a little. She smiled sweetly, calling him Xian, and said that he must have been very tired on the road and therefore sat down while waiting for the lady. He looked at the woman contemptuously, and then smiled broadly, greeting Aunt Chu Yu. After a while, they went inside. Sitting down on the chairs, Liu Zhuyu asked how Fan Xian's grandmother was doing in Danzhou. The young gentleman, with a smile on his face, said that a few days ago a murderer came to their house, but fortunately, the danger managed to escape. Then he said that everything else was fine with them in Danzhou. After that, he thanked Aunt Liu Ruyu for her concern. The second lady was smiling, gritting her teeth. She was thinking that this kid named Fan Xian, apparently, deliberately clung to the word aunt and did not call her second wife like everyone else. In her opinion, Fan Xian clearly said that the difference between these words was great. However, it seemed to her that the young master was quite courteous. Then the second lady smiled tensely and said that Fan Xian should just come into the house next time. Because what good would it be if people gossiped about the fact that Fan was being badly brought up in the mansion? Fan Xian also smiled tightly and agreed, since Aunt said so. He thought to himself that Aunt Liu Ruyu could not tolerate people, because Fan Xian, of course, reminded her that her husband had an affair on the side. Then the woman named Liu Ruyu smiled again and reported that Fan Xian's father worked in the household department. Then she asked the guy that he, apparently, had come to take the exam, or was planning to enter the service immediately. The young man, holding a clay glass with tea in his hands, smiled and said that he would do as his father ordered. Fan Xian then asked where his father was now and when he would return. Liu Ruyu replied briefly that young master's father would be back soon. Then they fell silent, continuing to squeeze out smiles. The woman told the guy to drink tea. They each took a sip from the brown clay cups in unison. The lady in the yellow dress walked very quickly through the Fan residence. The servants shouted at her to slow down. The second lady named Liu Ruyu and the young master named Fan Xian looked at the entrance to their room in surprise. Suddenly, the wooden door swung open and a young lady who was the most talented girl in the capital appeared in front of them. In addition, she was good at piano and chess and was also good at calligraphy and drawing. It was a grown-up young lady named Fan Zhuo, who was sent back to the capital by Fan Xian as a child. The girl was very happy to see her older brother. Fan Zhuo, wearing a beautiful yellow traditional robe, entered the room. While Liu Ruyu was calmly sipping her tea, a young gentleman named Fan Xian looked at his younger sister as if spellbound. The young gentleman, seeing the girl, immediately got up from his chair. Fan Zhuo walked up to him and bowed slightly, telling her older brother that she was very glad to meet him. Smiling warmly, Fan Xian stretched out his hands to his little sister and said that there was no need for such ceremonies, and the young man was already very happy to see his grown-up little sister named Fan Zhuo. Someone suddenly burst into the room with his hands on his hips. It was little Fan Ziyi. He cast a smug glance at his older half-brother and asked the young man about whether he was Fan Xiang. The young master giggled and asked Fan Zhuo about who this boy was. She turned around and looked at Ziyi, practically starting to say who this boy was. However, the young little master interrupted her and smugly informed her that he was the young master of the Fan family named Fan Ziyi. Then he pointed his finger at Xian and also arrogantly asked about the fact that, apparently, Fan Xian was the illegitimate child. A drop of cold sweat flowed down the guy's face. Fan Zhuo froze with an eerie expression on her face. Fan Xian then glanced at the chair where the second lady was sitting. It was empty. Apparently, Ms. Liu Zhuyu left, deciding to use her son's youth and ignorance so that he would immediately make a fuss and try to embarrass the young man. Fan Xian stood straight while Fan Ziyi hung around him and looked at him like an exhibit in a museum. The boy frowned up and said that Xian was very skinny, which means, in the opinion of little Ziyi, he was definitely an illegitimate child. Fan Xian, hearing these comments in his address, frowned at the bridge of his nose and clenched his teeth, catching a smile. Privately, the young master thought that this dumbass named Fan Ziyi, as it seemed to Fan Xian, so that he would not bring trouble to the Fan family with his boneless tongue in the future, it was necessary to immediately take up his upbringing. Fan Xian was about to say something caustic to Fan Ziyi. However, Fan Zhuo came to the rescue, armed with a long wooden ruler. She sternly told Fan Ziyi to come to her and give her his hand. The kid turned around in horror and looked at his older sister. Fan Xian also turned around and was very surprised by what was happening. The beautiful Fan Zhuo, holding a long wooden ruler in her hand, sternly looked at Fan Ziyi. She shouted at the little gentleman again, asking him if he was deaf. Then she held out her other hand and told the boy to give her his. The latter, trembling all over and drenched in cold sweat, slowly approached the elder sister, holding out his palms. Little Fan Ziyi even squeezed his eyes shut from fear. Fan Xian couldn't hide his surprise and remained silent, looking at what was happening with his eyes wide open. The frightened little Fan Si put out his hands in front of Fan Zhuo and she, with an angry and stern expression on her face, hit her fingers hard with a long wooden ruler on her palms. He winced in pain. Beads of cold sweat stood out on the boy's face. Then, trembling all over and stammering a lot, he asked his sister why she. He did not have time to finish, as he again received a blow on the palms with a wooden ruler from Fan Zhuo. The boy shuddered again and even screamed, while the frightened little Fan Si, covered in droplets of cold sweat, trembled and blew on his palms. Reddened from blows with a wooden ruler, Fan Zhuo lectured him. She sternly told the young second master that, firstly, Fan Si could not call his older brother by name. Secondly, Fan Si, according to the older sister named Fan Zhuo, should have remembered the status of their family and not say such absurd nonsense. Fan Zhuo's gaze became even stricter and scarier. Little Fan Si tensed up even more and began to break out in cold sweat because of fear. The girl continued that, thirdly, punishment for such disrespect to her brother was a natural thing. Then the blonde girl smiled sweetly and asked Fan Xian if she had spoken correctly. He exhaled and looked away, agreeing with his younger sister. Fan Xian was really scared himself, while Fan Zhuo blamed the second young master. Having finished with the lectures and punishment, little Fan Si, wiping away the flow of tears, screamed and called for his mother. The older children remained standing in place. Then the second young master ran, still crying and screaming, calling for his mother. The blonde Fan Zhuo, continuing to look after the retreating figure of the crying baby Fan Si, sighed and said that he really always ran to his mother in tears. Fan Xian shifted his gaze to his younger sister and said that he was wondering for what reason this child was behaving like this. Fan Zhuo, holding a long wooden ruler in her hands, folded her hands in front of her and, closing her eyes, calmly reported that it was because Fan Si was a stupid pig, unable to think independently. Fan Xian looked at his sister strangely without saying a word. He was thinking to himself, so that's how it turned out. After some time, Fan Xian and Fan Zhuo were sitting on wooden chairs, having a nice conversation. At some point, Fan Xian asked his younger sister about why she had hit Fan Si on the arm with a ruler. She gave the young man a sly look and said that their father himself allowed Fan Zhuo to discipline the baby Fan Si. The young gentleman looked away and scratched his chin thoughtfully, sighing. He then said that everything happening here was significantly different from what Xian had imagined before. Zhuo opened her eyes in surprise and asked the young man about what she thought he meant by the patriarchal system. Fan Xian frowned, thinking even harder, and then quietly said that he didn't mean that, but rather the affairs within the Fan family. Fan Zhuo lowered her head down and said that she wasn't strong enough right now. Fan Xian closed his eyes and reminded his younger sister that the girl should not forget that her strength strongly depended on the attitude of one particular person towards her. Fan Zhuo, expressing complete seriousness, reminded her older brother that he also should not have forgotten that this one particular person was their father. For a while, the brother and sister were silent, looking down at the floor. But then, suddenly, they giggled in unison. The serious atmosphere collapsed and the guys began to talk happily again, clearly missing the live communication with each other. Fan Zhuo bluntly said that even though they corresponded, Fan Zhuo and Fan Xian had not chatted in person for so long. The girl really missed such warm and pleasant moments. Fan Xian, smiling warmly, said that seeing that his little sister was doing well, he was not so worried anymore. Then the blonde girl smiled slyly and said that thanks to Fan Xian's advice, the mood within the family really became calmer. Fan Xian looked at his sister in surprise. Privately, he also couldn't stop being surprised that the guy didn't think at all that the story from his past life could even repeat itself. Then the dark-haired youth said that even though he had lived all his life in Danzhou, however, Fan Xian knew about the status of the second lady named Liu Ruyu, so he was very polite and courteous to her. Zhuo briefly replied that she knew about it. Fan Xian then asked his younger sister if she had received his letter. The girl tensed and drops of cold sweat appeared on her face. She said she received the letter last night. In addition, this letter was delivered by a man in a black robe, which scared the young lady madly. In her head, she recalled the moment from yesterday, when in the evening this man in black burst into her window and said that Fan Zhuo had received a letter. The girl shuddered with horror, remembering this moment. Fan Xian sighed heavily and asked if Fan Zhuo knew about the reason why Xian had come to the capital. She smiled and said she knew the reason. The young gentleman opened his mouth in shock and cried out, not ceasing to be surprised. The blonde young lady smiled again and said that she wasn't the only one who knew about this reason. Everyone knew about this reason. The dark-haired guy screamed in shock again. Then he gritted his teeth, biting his lip. Cold sweat broke out on his face. The young man quietly said that he thought that his father had secretly brought him here to the capital. Fan Zhuo slyly looked at her older brother and quietly said that all the children of the aristocrats were curious about what kind of business it was that brought an illegitimate child from the Fan family to the capital. He also slyly, but tensely looked at his younger sister, saying that after all, no one knew him here. The young man wondered why he was so interesting to everyone. In a normal tone of voice, Fan Zhuo said that it was all because the girl their father had chosen for Fan Xian was very famous. Xian leaned on the back of his chair and exhaled, saying that he understood everything. Marrying the Prime Minister's daughter was really quite a serious matter. Fan Zhuo said that it wasn't just that. Xian focused on the words his younger sister was saying. Fan Zhuo grinned and held up her index finger in front of the young man. Then she told him that she was forced to correct the guy. Fan Xian was supposed to marry the Prime Minister's illegitimate daughter. Chapter 17. For 10 years, the capital has proudly borne its title of the most prosperous city. She was a tiny, independent, prosperous world. However, in this luxurious world lived the most corrupt officials in history. The head of these corrupt officials was Prime Minister Lin Zhufu. This same Lin Zhufu was a native of a poor family, who step by step came to his current position in society. This man named Liu Zhufu worked cunningly and fiercely, but with all this, he pretended to be an angel, which in fact never kept his promises. After listening to this story, Fan Xian had mixed feelings. He, continuing to be surprised, asked Fan Zhuo about the fact that, really, even such a person had an illegitimate daughter. The dark-haired young man was interested in the question of why this prime minister had to expose himself. Fan Zhuo looked at her older brother and said that, so that he would not think about it. It was rumored that the news about the illegitimate daughter of Prime Minister Lin Zhufu spread from the palace. Fan Xian asked his sister again, and then chuckled, suggesting that perhaps the emperor himself had spread the news. Fan Zhuo reported that aristocrats had been gossiping about this before, so Lin Zhufu, in fact, was forced to admit the existence of his illegitimate daughter. Eventually, the emperor himself stood up for Prime Minister Lin Rufu, so the situation became even more confusing. Fan Xian listened to his younger sister's words with his eyes closed. Fan Zhuo then said that Fan Xian's reaction was quite unexpected for her. Zhuo did not understand why Fan Xian did not react in any way, knowing full well that the young master was going to marry an illegitimate daughter. Fan Xian reported that he had a reaction. The young man leaned forward a little, resting his chin on his hand. Fan Xian frowned at the bridge of his nose, saying that he could not wait to ask this one particular person about what intentions he had picked up such a bride for Fan Xian. Suddenly, the boys heard the voice of the servants greeting Mr. Fan, who had finally returned home. Fan Xian immediately got up from his chair and went to the exit, finally offering his younger sister Fan Zhuo to take a walk around the city sometime and remember the good old days. The girl agreed, smiling sweetly. Fan Xian waved to her and left the room. The head of the family named Fan Xian was walking down the corridor. A few moments later, his illegitimate son named Fan Xian appeared in front of him, coming around the corner. Father and son, similar to each other, silently looked into each other's eyes, without saying a word. A few seconds later, one of the dark-robed servants standing behind Fan Xian could not stand it and informed his master that a young master, that is, his son, was standing in front of him. He looked again, not expressing any emotion at all. Fan Xian then walked past Fan Xian and only after a while told him to follow him. When Fan Xian found himself in his father's room, it was already evening. The room was illuminated by the faint light of lamps. While Fan Xian was reading a book, sitting at the table, Fan Xian stood and looked at the room, a dark room with very weak lighting. Fan Xian, without looking up from his book at all, told Fan Xiang that the dark-haired young man was very similar to his mother. The young gentleman standing in front of his desk looked complacently at his father and chuckled, as if asking him if he really looked like his mother. Ignoring the barb in his address, the bearded man, also without distracting himself from the book, asked Fan Xian about how he had been living in Danzhou all these years. He chuckled again and said that apart from that mercenary, there was nothing interesting about life in Danzhou. Continuing the interrogation, the father of the family asked, with a glance, without looking up from his book, asking Fan Xian if he knew the reason why the father had summoned his illegitimate son. He came a little closer to the table, responding with agreement. Fan Xian lowered the book and looked wearily at the dark-haired youth. He looked down and asked if Fan Xian was offended by him. The young man closed his eyes and sighed, saying that he was not offended at all. Then the guy looked sternly at his father and said that when Fan Xian was taken to the capital, he was not warned at all that Fan Xian was supposed to marry Miss Lin. Fan Jian clenched his fist tightly and was silent for a while. Then, expressing very strange emotions, similar to anger and contempt, but also similar to indifference, he asked his illegitimate son that. Apparently, Fan Jian already knew everything about the upcoming marriage. Fan Jian pulled his dark eyebrows to the bridge of his nose and carefully looked at his father from under his brows. Then the young master asked about his assumption, where it meant that, apparently, the Fan family decided to gain more influence through this marriage of illegitimate children of both parties. Fan Jian put the book aside, remaining silent. After being silent for some time and examining his grown-up illegitimate son, the bearded Fan Jian chuckled and picked up the book again. Continuing to grin, the man calmly said that it was great that the young gentleman named Fan Jian was angry. The dark-haired guy was surprised and asked his father again. He said that he had received news from Danzhou. In addition, it seemed to Fan Jian that Fan Jian was one of those types of people who almost never shows emotions at all. Then an adult dark-haired man with a beard smiled slightly again and gave the young man a little advice, which was that the boy should give free rein to emotions, otherwise he would wither away altogether. To this advice, Fan Jian said with full seriousness that, to begin with, he also had something to say. Something interesting. The young gentleman named Fan Jian leveled up and made a haughty face, even slightly expressing aggression, informing his father that he was not the type of person who could be pushed around. Fan Jian gripped the book tightly in his hands and clenched his teeth, even to the point of trembling. Through them, an already angry man with a beard muttered, justifying that he was not going to push around a young gentleman named Fan Jian. However, he also said that this marriage, whether Fan Jian liked it or not, was necessary. Fan Jian, standing firmly on his own, said that this issue was not even discussed. Fan Jian, putting on a creepy expression, haughtily looked down at his father and said that he could try. When the creepy and terrifyingly oppressive atmosphere between father and son began to calm down gradually, and they fell silent. Calming down a little, Fan Jian changed his tone to a softer one and asked his illegitimate son named Fan Jian, deliberately calling him child in order to soften the situation, why he did not understand what all this fuss was for. Then a man with a dark, neatly trimmed beard said that Miss Lin was gentle and attentive, so she was also smart and reasonable. Fan Jian thought that Miss Lin really was a great match for marriage. Fan Jian's face showed displeasure. Fan Jian continued to ask the young man that, in addition to all this, does Jian realize that even with their status, marriage was the best way to stabilize their situation? Fan Jian sternly looked at his father, who was crucified in front of him, and listened attentively to what he was saying. He was grinning, spreading his hands and asking if Fan Jian really thought that Lin Rufu's illegitimate daughter was not equal to him. The young master believed that, judging by Fan Jian's behavior and tone, he was quite sincere. Fan Jian then asked the bearded man in a stern tone about why he had to marry the daughter of Prime Minister Lin Rufu. The man closed his eyes and was silent for a while, thinking about what to say to him. Then Fan Jian opened his eyes and, slightly moving his mustache, said that it was all because Miss Lin's mother was the princess' younger sister. He then reported that the princess never married, as she instead secretly managed the affairs of the palace. In addition, it was she who ensured a stable flow of funds to the palace and the capital. After these words, Fan Jian asked if it was true that Fan Jian now understood why he had to marry Miss Lin. Fan Jian slammed his fist into his palm. The young master's eyes lit up with the words loud gossip when he thought about it. And so it was. It really was a very loud gossip. The prime minister had an affair with a princess. Fan Jian believed that it was no wonder that Lin Jufu had so swiftly and smoothly climbed the career ladder, without having any connections or money at the same time. Fan Jian, pulling his dark eyebrows to the bridge of his nose, said that the princess had a single heiress, and she herself had been engaged in state affairs for a long time. In addition, the man believed that whoever married Miss Lin would eventually be able to become the head of the imperial family. Fan Jian then asked about the company that was currently under the management of the princess. The young man was interested in the fact that earlier this company was not owned by the Yi family. Fan Jian agreed with the guy's words and said that earlier this same company originally belonged to Fan Jian's mother. The young gentleman, hearing these words from his father, raised an eyebrow. He began to listen more attentively to the man. Fan Jian firmly said that the young man would just have to take what was rightfully his. Fan Jian folded his hands in front of him and bowed slightly, telling his father that he admired his foresight. Fan Jian got up from the table and looked at his illegitimate son. Fan Xian raised his head and asked about whether this marriage would really be able to return the family business to the young master's mother. Fan Xian closed his eyes and sighed, telling the young man that, of course, they could not do without difficulties. He then told the guy not to forget that Fan Xian was in charge of the household department, not finance. Then the man left the table and said that, however, the Prime Minister had doubts about this marriage. Fan Xian said that he sincerely hoped that Fan Xian would prove himself well in the capital. Fan Xian held out his hand in front of him and looked at his father in surprise, asking him that after all, the Fan family had provided them with strong cooperation and mutual benefit. Why did Prime Minister Lin Rufu doubt about marriage? Fan Xian, hearing such a good question, explained that the Fan family was one of the most important families in the capital, and Lin Rufu was a civil servant. Because of these reasons, Prime Minister Lin Rufu was worried that this marriage might arouse His Majesty's suspicions, which would lead to great trouble. A burning light bulb appeared near the young man's head. Eureka! Fan Xian happily snapped his fingers and said that he understood everything. The young master then held up his index finger in front of him, pointing at Fan Xian. The guy chuckled and said that, as it turned out, nothing had been decided yet. In addition, everyone started to shave their heads early, since all this was only a unilateral decision of the Fan family. Fan Xian shuddered and thought about the phrase "shave your head." The man did not understand at all what this phrase meant. Then Fan Xian sternly looked at Fan Xian and said that the young master should have remembered that no one should have found out about their conversation today. Otherwise they would not live. The young man turned his back, starting to leave the room. Then he waved his right hand and said that he knew all this perfectly well, so he would definitely be extremely careful. Then Fan Xian turned around slightly and cast a smirking glance at his father, telling him that Fan Xian was the person who was not afraid of death at all. After a certain period of time, Fan Xian was lying on a wooden bed in his chambers. The young man thought a lot. After today's conversation, it seemed to Fan Xian that his father, named Fan Xian, still had warm feelings for the young man. Apparently, the reason why Fan Xian was sent to Danzhou as a very young child was because the person who killed the young master's mother was still in the capital until now. The young gentleman decided that he would need to find out more about this a little later. However, the guy wondered if he really wanted to marry a sick girl. He was worried about the thought, which was that, wasn't that the equivalent of Fan Xian lying to her? Suddenly, the young man turned over on his side and refused his own words, continuing to consider himself completely different, but a person who just felt sorry for a sick girl named Miss Lin. Fan Xian looked at the black mat suitcase that Xian's mother had left for Uncle Wu Zhu. He sighed, thinking that in addition to all this, the young man also did not have a key that would open this black box made of an unknown indestructible material. Then the guy plopped down on the bed again, sighing. He decided that he didn't care about all this and should stop thinking, because it seemed to the young man that his head was about to burst from so much information. Fan Xian decided that it was necessary to go to bed soon. As they say, the morning of the evening is more complicated. Meanwhile, Fan Xian walked out onto the white stone balcony, holding his hands behind his back. The man was looking at a beautiful dark sky, in the center of which was a crescent moon. Privately, Fan Xian addressed Xiao King, Fan Xian's mother, warmly telling her that her baby had become quite an adult. Fan Xian, in Fan Xian's opinion, was, like Xiao King, smart beyond his years. Then the man pulled his dark eyebrows to the bridge of his nose, peering into the crescent moon. He was thinking that Chen Pingping was against Fan Xian coming here, so Fan Xian brought the young master while Chen Pingping was on vacation. Fan Xian turned to Xiao King again and said that one person had guaranteed that the Yi family's property would be returned to her son named Fan Xian. The man sighed and warmly told her to himself that Yi Zai should not worry. Here in the capital, no one will harm the young master. The next day, Fan Xian, Fan Zhuo and Fan Si went for a walk around the city. For a while they rode on a cart drawn by 2 brown horses. While the guys were driving, Fan Zhuo was feeding her joyful older brother some sweets. Fan Si was slightly contemptuous of what was happening next to him. After tasting the candy, Fan Xian, drenched in tears and drooling, shouted that he was too sour. Fan Zhuo laughed loudly while the young man stuck out his tongue, unable to overcome the sourness. Fan Si, looking at all this, opened his mouth in shock. He did not understand that it was his older sister, whose furious gaze usually melted the snowy peaks of the mountains. That was exactly in front of him. In addition, the kid was completely perplexed whether Fan Xian was even a person. The young second master suggested that, could it be that this Fan Xian had some extraordinary abilities? Then the disgruntled little Fan Si folded his hands in front of him and contemptuously addressed Fan Xiang, telling him that the guy should have known that Siyi took Xian with him only for the sake of a sister named Zhuo. To which Fan Xian, jokingly, arrogantly pointed out to the boy that he thought that Siyi himself, on the contrary, had followed them. The boy began to kick his arms and legs, furiously reporting that this was not the case at all. Then Fan Siyi began to shout loudly at Fan Xian, telling him that he was the young master of the Fanny family, which is why Fan Xian, in the boy's opinion, had to respect him. The young man chuckled and was silent for a while. Fan Xian then sighed and asked Siyi if he really thought that the more often he repeated it, the more Fan Xian would respect the young gentleman named Fan Siyi. Then he chuckled again and spread his hands to the sides, advising the boy to learn from his mother named Liu Ruyu to communicate with other people. Fan Siyi began to cry again and climb up to Fan Zhuo with hugs, so that she would feel sorry for him, since the boy believed that the girl herself saw how Fan Xian offended him. However, she, sweating profusely, tried to fend off such an onslaught from baby Fan Siyi. The coachman, at this time, not paying attention to the commotion inside, calmly drove forward, driving the horses. After a while, the cart passed by a neighborhood with restaurants. Feeling the gorgeous smell, the hungry baby Fan Siyi leaned out of the window, telling the others that it smelled very delicious outside. Then the boy, intoxicated by the smell of delicious food, offered to drop in for lunch at a restaurant. The other brother and sister clearly liked the idea. They stopped nearby. The coachman informed the gentleman that they were at the inn. Then he said that the gentleman and madam are from the Fan family. Fan Siyi raised his hands up in joy and shouted. Then the happy kid, smiling with all his teeth, grabbed his older sister by the hand and dragged her to the restaurant. She, at this time, asked the boy to run slower. Fan Xian walked and smiled, taking his time at all. Suddenly, an elderly woman crept up behind Fan Xian, and he bulged his eyes in surprise. An elderly woman had a bunch of books with a blue cover in her hands. She slyly looked at the young gentleman and asked if he needed a book, because it was all forbidden. Looking at the small stacks of books that the elderly woman was holding in her hands, Fan Xian smiled slyly and even stuck out his tongue, asking the elderly woman where the books came from, Japan and Korea or Europe and the USA. The gray-haired woman raised her eyebrows and looked at Fan Xian in surprise. Then she looked sternly at the young man and in a conspiratorial voice quietly announced that she had the most popular novel in the capital in her hands. Then she handed the book to the guy and said that Fan Xian was really lucky today, since it was quite difficult to find this most popular novel. Fan Xian took the blue book in his hands and looked at it carefully. Then the guy opened his eyes wide. The title of the novel, The Dream in the Red Chamber, was in front of his eyes. The young man was surprised, thinking that, wasn't it The Dream in the Red Chamber that Fan Xian had once copied? Fan Xian opened a blue book called Dream in the Red Chamber on one of the pages. The young man began to read the text, which said that only women were able to make a man feel differently. Women could raise a man to heaven with their shameful thoughts and words. The young gentleman began to read even more carefully into the words that only one touch was enough, that it was a natural and frightening feeling at the same time. The text about what made the reader's body languish with forbidden passion and something else about the blissful flight seemed very familiar to Fan Xian. The guy, reading the text in the book, turned cold all over. The sly old woman looked defiantly at Fan Xian and told the young man that this was just a part, and the most interesting thing was ahead. Fan Xian immediately gave a couple of coins to the elderly woman and hurried away, hiding the book under his clothes. The gray-haired woman smiled as she counted the coins and thought that this book was really very good. After a certain period of time, Fan Xian went into the restaurant and walked up to the table where Fan Zhuo and Fan Siyi were sitting. The girl asked where her older brother had been before. Little Fan Siyi smiled slyly and pointed his thumb at the window, telling his older sister that he had seen Fan Xian buy some book from an elderly woman through the window. Then the boy smiled even wider and said that he would like to advise the young man not to buy such things from people on the street, if Fan Xian, of course, would like to avoid universal censure. Fan Zhuo exhaled and asked Fan Xian about which book little Fan Siyi was talking about. The young man, carefully taking out the blue binding of the book from under his clothes, asked Fan Zhuo if she remembered about the dream in the red chamber that Fan Xian had once told about. The girl replied that, of course, she remembered about this work. Then the young master put the blue book on the table and handed it to the younger sister. She opened the book and carefully read what she had written. With each word, her eyes grew wider and wider. Then she got excited and said that it was the first time she had seen this book. Surprised, Fan Siyi stood nearby and looked at the book that Zhuo was holding in her hands. Fan Xian walked up to Fan Zhuo and gently took her by the shoulders, telling her that everything was fine and he did not accuse her of anything. Drops of cold sweat dripped down the smiling Fan Xian's face. For himself, the guy thought that he knew perfectly well that Zhuo would not be able to resist sharing the book she liked with her friends. However, Xian didn't think at all that this book would be distributed by all sorts of merchants. Cold sweat trickled down Fan Zhuo's agitated face. She looked away and scratched her chin, thinking that, as she thought, it could be the work of the princess. The girl said that one day this princess came to their manor to chat, and accidentally saw this book, which Fan Xian had copied especially for Zhuo. After that, the princess made a copy for herself and took it with her. Fan Zhuo reflexively folded the book into a tube. Fan Xian, seeing this, raised his eyebrows up and bulged his eyes wide, wondering what had just happened to the blue book. Then the girl guiltily said that she could not have imagined that this book would become public and end up in the hands of hundreds of people. Fan Xian smiled faintly and laughed softly, saying that it means that the book first spread among the nobility, and then it also hit the market. Fan Xian really underestimated the power of piracy. Then Fan Ci joined the conversation. He quietly asked Fan Xian if he was the one who really wrote this magnificent book. Fan Xian looked at him strangely and asked why he needed this information. Fascinated with bright stars in his eyes, Fan Ci pointed his finger at the young man and loudly asked if the dream in the red chamber was really the work of Fan Xian. Cunningly examining the second young master, Fan Xian asked the boy if he had read it. A blushing Fan Ci looked away and said, stammering, that he had only looked at this book with one eye, considering it very boring. The cunning young man asked about what the boy was so dissatisfied with then. Fan Ci blushed even more and quietly told that, in truth, he had read it. Red as a tomato, Fan Ci did not dare to look at Fan Xian. Then, continuing to blush, he said that he praised the author for his extraordinary poetic style and skill. Fan Xian smiled sweetly and looked at Fan Ci's rosy cheeks. Then he asked the boy about the fact that, apparently, it turned out that little Ci had already begun to admire Xiang on the sly. Inspired, Ci suddenly turned around with glowing eyes and a wide smile. Agreeing with Xian's words, the second young master said that Fan Xian could earn a huge pile of money by writing just a couple of words. The boy thought it was very cool. The respect for Fan Xian was clearly increased. Then the young master folded his little hands into fists, and happily said that it was no wonder why the elder sister named Fan Zhuo admired him so much. Fan Xian, listening to this with a smile, thought that Ci had come to respect him more not because of his book, but because of the money that Xian could potentially earn. A drop of cold sweat began to flow down the guy's face. However, Fan Ci still couldn't calm down. His brown eyes turned into gold coins. The boy reported that this manuscript was sold in huge batches on the market. In addition to all this, at least 8 taels in silver were taken for one copy. Ci put his fingers in the pistols and continued to tell Fan Xian that only a young man could write such masterpieces. He began to imitate shooting from pistols, encouraging Xian that if he suddenly decided to cut down some money, he now knew who to turn to. Fan Xian remained silent. He raised his eyebrows and thought with a smile on his face. Unfortunately, Xian and baby Ci had a conflict of interest, even if Fan Xian didn't really know anything about the boy. However, the young man could not discern a potential enemy in him. A slight grin formed on Xian's face. He was thinking that, after all, he and little Fan Ci were blood brothers. The dark-haired young man believed that many potential tragedies could, in theory, be avoided if the relationship between the brothers was friendly. Fan Xian looked at Fan Ci, whose eyes had become even more like gold coins. The boy himself enthusiastically considered something related to earning money on his fingers, even sticking out his tongue. Fan Xian was thinking that maybe he should let little Ci do this. Fan Xian then cleared his throat, attracting the attention of the second young master. Xian asked the boy about what, by the way, he did not say about why he followed Xian. Wasn't Fan Ci supposed to be studying right now? The kid froze for a while, but then stuck to Fan Xian with the cutest expression the kid had. He put his index fingers together, expressing embarrassment, and, blushing slightly, said that his mother, named Liu Ruyu, allowed him. The boy also reported that Liu Zhuyu told her son that he needed to spend more time with his older brother so that he would have a positive influence on the boy named Fan Ci. Fan Xian, at this time, strenuously trying to detach himself from his younger half-brother, turned cold and sweated all over. Cold sweat poured down Xian's face like a hail, and his face expressed horror. To himself, the young man thought that this little gentleman named Fan Ci, as it turned out, also knew how to pretend to be a cutie. The guy decided that, apparently, Fan Ci was ready for anything for money. After some time that Fan Xian spent thinking, he announced that he was ready to cooperate with baby Ci. He began to shout joyfully, thinking about the upcoming deal. After a certain period of time, food was brought and Fan Ziyi, happy as an elephant, was eating a leg of fried chicken. Fan Ziyan was drinking something from a blue clay glass at that time. Fan Zhuo was reading a blue-bound book that Fan Ziyan had bought not so long ago. The girl said that the book was very good, but these damned speculators deliberately distorted some fragments. Fan Ziyan closed his eyes and, holding a clay glass in his hands, said in a calm tone that this was a normal marketing move, so Fan Zhuo shouldn't have taken everything so personally. The young man believed that after all, it was quite logical that people bought the book after viewing only the initial fragment. Then Fan Ziyan put the glass on the table and, smiling slightly, asked Fan Zhuo, assuming that it could be that the girl was angry that the fragment placed on the first page changed the original message of the book. The girl raised her eyebrows and agreed, since such a delightful text began to be sold as some kind of consumer goods. Fan Zhuo reported that she was really furious about all this, to which Fan Ziyan spread his hands to the sides and shrugged his shoulders, saying that dealers in banned books had to do this in order to increase their sales. The girl wanted to say something else, however, Fan Ziyan interrupted her and said, smiling slyly that, in addition to all this, if Fan Ziyan takes care of these sales, he will be much more brazen than all of them combined. Fan Ziyan smiled slyly and leaned on his arm. The young man reported that there were 10 chapters in one volume. He decided that, in this case, the guy would write 10 chapters and make a title page. The young master's gaze became even more cunning, which was even frightening. He said that his task was to increase the reader's interest with each chapter. All this was necessary in order for them to want to buy this book to finish reading it at home. The dark-haired guy spread his hands to the sides and said that Fan Ziyan would divide the work into several chapters, like the Western Wing, and the young man also decided to add jokes and songs there. Among other things, Fan Ziyan decided that he could use Yanchu as an introductory fragment. In the text itself, Fan Ziyan believed that it was necessary to highlight all the delicate words in red ink. Then the young man quoted part of the poem, which said that he had seen the fall of the red color, and everything was peaceful in the garden, that he wanted to rush headlong, run serenely. Then the young gentleman wanted to highlight in red ink the feeling of awkwardness in the line where it was said about experiencing a feeling where someone knew what Bao Yu was thinking. The girls who filled the garden, where in this line Fan Ziyan highlighted the word surrendered to the serenity of time, in red ink. The family, imagining the girls who read Fan Ziyan's novel with loving eyes, thought. Fan Zhuo said that only at first glance it might seem that it was just a set of random words. However, the young lady was sure that it was these random words that would encourage buyers to continue reading. Fan Zhuo thought that all this was simply unbelievable. Suddenly, Fan Zhuo blushed deeply, saying that she was surprised that her older brother named Fan Ziyan, as it turned out, was engaged in all sorts of such obscenities. Fan Ziyan folded his hands behind his head and smiled broadly, saying that there was nothing wrong with it just because it was just a way to attract the attention of readers. From the words of Fan Ziyan, the respect of this kid named Fan Ziyi increased even more. The boy with golden eyes like coins stuck to Xian again, who was smiling and sweating coldly. Ziyi began to loudly announce that his mother, named Liu Shuyu, was right. Then he turned to his brother named Fan Ziyan and said that he was really very capable. The kid said that he decided from now on not to leave Fan Ziyan a step. Fan Ziyan, at this time, shifted his gaze to the little girl stealthily, imagining how the second lady Liu Ruyu ordered her son to watch Xiang earlier. The dark-haired young man thought that Ziyi was a stupid child. Mrs. Liu Ruyu Fan Zhang's intentions were already clear. It was already obvious to him that the woman had sent this baby to follow him. A man loudly exclaimed about where these guys from the Fan family were from. A disgruntled man with a fan in his hands, named Hezong Wei, was indignant about the fact that Fan Ziyan wrote only about one obscenity. That man genuinely didn't understand what talent Fan Ziyan could be talking about. The servants looked at the Fan family intensely and maliciously. The second man, with a bowl in his hands, named Guo Bao Kun, just grinned, looking at the young people at the next table. The indignant little Fan Ziyi got up from his seat and, pointing his finger at the next table, began to shout loudly that no one dares to treat the boy so rudely, since he was the son of the Fan family. Then little Ziyi asked about who was the same scoundrel who challenged the little master. Fan Ziyan, at this time, looked at what was happening in surprise. While the kid was shouting indignantly, Ziyan thought about the fact that the people who were sitting in those places were probably people of high status. Fan Ziyan decided to give them the opportunity to say all sorts of nonsense, as he believed that there was no point in responding to these nonsense by shouting. Already all permeated with anger, Fan Ziyi began to roll up the white sleeves of his clothes with words that the man with a fan in his hands named He Zongwei would approach the boy more quickly so that he would pile on him. The agitated Fan Ziyan wanted to stop Fan Ziyi, but Fan Zhuo, calmly sipping her tea, said that let Ziyi go to fight. For that matter, seeing the mute question on Fan Ziyan's face, Zhuo said to give the boy a chance to prove himself. Besides, since the older brother and sister were also here, then nothing terrible would obviously happen. After listening to the younger sister, Fan Ziyan turned back to the table and continued to drink tea with a smile on his face, as Fan Zhuo did. Meanwhile, panting and angry, the fighting kid Fan Ziyi walked to the table of those indignant gentlemen. The boy frowned at the bridge of his nose and pointed at He Zongwei, asking him whether he had blurted out those taunts in the direction of his older brother Fan Ziyan. He smirked smugly and asked what would happen if that was the case. Then He Zongwei began to mimic Fan Ziyi, quoting his words that his older brother's book was a real masterpiece, and He Zhuiwei was lying, since he told the boy back. The man with the fan looked arrogantly at the boy and continued to sneer. Fan Ziyan, hearing this, pricked up his ears, raising his eyebrows upwards. Fan Zhuo smiled and said that little Ziyi began to praise Fan Ziyan. He giggled and smiled, realizing that the boy really began to do it. At this time, He Zongwei's taunts angered Fan Ziyi completely. He attacked the man with a fan in his hands with pre-declaring words that how could he dare to say such things about Fan Ziyi's older brother. The boy flew across the table and almost hit He Zongwei with his fist. However, he managed to dodge in time. The boy grabbed the man's cloth headdress with his hand, thereby loosening his hair. This angered He Zongwei in earnest. He began to shout, asking Fan Ziyi about how such a kid had so much arrogance. How could a boy attack other people in broad daylight at all? Then he furiously asked the little gentleman if he even knew what the law was. Fan Ziyi, attacking the man again with his small fist, said that he was the law. In the moment before the blow, one of the servants managed to grab the boy by the hand before he could hit He Zongwei, who was already closing his eyes. Cold sweat was running down his face. The creepy servant lifted Fan Ziyi up by the hand. He started kicking and screaming that he was in a lot of pain. Then the sly kid, trying to attract the attention of other guests of the inn, began to shout, so to speak, wondering what kind of garbage in general dared to raise his hand against my master. Getting up from his table with food, Guo Baokun straightened his clothes and told his creepy servant to let the boy go due to the fact that he was afraid that this incident could ruin his reputation. Baby Fan Ziyi was already mentally preparing for the fact that it was a terrible end, and he himself would be extremely hurt. Suddenly, Fan Ziyan caught the second young gentleman by the collar of his blue rich clothes, and, turning around, stopped him and put him on the floor next to him. The boy panted in horror, pouring streams of cold sweat, trying to realize how lucky he was to be saved by an older half-brother named Fan Ziyan. Fan Zhuo was standing behind her and looked very sternly at those men at the next table. Fan Ziyan leveled himself and sternly looked at these men, telling them that his younger brother was still very young, and these arrogant men hurt his feelings. In addition, these violent actions on their part, in Ziyan's opinion, were already too cruel and beyond the bounds of dignity. Another man turned to Brother Kun, telling him that the girl who came with Fan Xiang and Fan Ziyi seemed very familiar to him. He Zongwei, at this time, kept trying to fix his hairstyle, which was always falling apart. Drops of cold sweat dripped down He Zongwei's face. Guo Baokun looked at Fan Zhuo with a bored expression. He then suggested that, wasn't it Miss Fan, who was the most talented girl in the capital? The men then assumed that the guy standing next to them must have been, as they thought, the young master of the Fan family. Guo Baokun grinned maliciously, cruelly provoking Fan Ziyan with his words that whose child was it who possessed such impudence. Fan Ziyan furrowed his brows to the bridge of his nose, revealing his terrifying expression. Guo Baokun chuckled again, imitating that he remembered that Fan Ziyan was the child of that woman. A frightened kid named Fan Ziyi ran to Fan Zhuo, who was standing behind everyone. Fan Ziyan came forward and approached Guo Baokun, asking who he was himself, since he himself spoke so sharply and without a drop of embarrassment about Fan Xiang. A man with big cheeks introduced Guo Baokun from the Prince faction as the only son of the Minister of Rights Shu Yuzhai. That man repeated Mr. Guo's name again, Guo Baokun. He was greatly surprised that Fan Ziyan didn't know this gentleman with a bored expression. Then Guo Baokun himself got into the conversation, who, looking down at Fan Ziyan, said that he was offended that a member of the Fan family decided to use his power to oppress others. Fan Ziyan, hearing such a statement, laughed. He then said that scientists like this Mr. Guo Bao Kun were inferior in their talents. However, they clearly have no ambitions. Then the grinning Fan Xian looked at Guo Bao Kun, who was now standing not far from him, and said that they, the so-called talents, instead of studying diligently, disappear in places like this. The dark-haired guy began to ask them about where their ambition had gone and where their humility had gone. Outraged, He Zhongwei began waving his fan towards Fan Xian, telling the young man that he should not have thought at all that his family's influence could help after such statements. Fan Xian waved his hand to the side and said that he had not even thought of it. In addition to all this, the dark-haired young man said that all of them sitting at this table were close to the court and were not afraid of the authorities. According to Xian, these gentlemen respected themselves and defended their opinions. Fan Xian thought it was admirable. Fan Xian then walked closer to Guo Bao Kun and stroked his paper fan with his fingers. Fan Xian's smiling face struck terror into Guo Bao Kun. He trembled violently as he listened to him. Fan Xian, continuing to smile, said that these gentlemen were already skinny. Weren't they afraid that one day they would just be blown away by the wind from their paper fans? Xian also suggested that this may have been their way of expressing self-respect. The young man smiled even more eerily, continuing to touch Guo Bao Kun's fan with his fingers, and said that such a thing really would not be taught. In his opinion, one could only be born with it. Suddenly outraged and frightened, Guo Bao Kun folded his fan and shouted loudly to his servant, asking him what he was waiting for, when it was necessary to beat the young man sooner. Hearing his master's order, the purple-robed servant raised his fist back and ran at Fan Xian, attacking him. Xian immediately dodged the attack by leaning back a little. The tense and angry servant attacked the guy again with his fist. However, Fan Xian hit the man on the wrist and he began to lose his vigilance from surprise. The young master immediately punched this servant in the face, knocking out his teeth. That servant even had blood spurting out of his mouth in flight. The huge man flew away through the wooden window and remained lying, leaning his whole body on the windowsill. At the same time, the window frames themselves were knocked out of their hinges. One of these wooden windows was lying on the floor altogether. He Zhongwei gripped the fan tightly in his hands and trembled with terror. A man with chubby cheeks fell to the floor in horror and gradually crawled to the other end of the room. Guo Bao Kun dropped his fan on the floor altogether, gradually leaning on the wooden table in horror. Then Guo Bao Kun began to point a trembling finger towards Fan Xian and, drenched in drops of cold sweat, he began to scream in horror, stammering a lot that Fan Xian would regret it. Fan Xian, meanwhile, folded his hands in front of him and sternly looked at this arrogant Guo Bao Kun. Behind him stood the calm but stern Fan Zhuo, looking at these men with fans with a kind of condemnation. Fan Si closed his eyes slyly and, sticking out his tongue slightly, showed Guo Bao Kun and He Zhongwei his little finger. Fan Xian then turned around and followed Guo Bao Kun to the exit without deigning his reaction to Guo Bao Kun. Fan Zhuo calmly followed her elder brother. The cheerful little Fan Si moved around the restaurant, even skipping. This disregard angered Guo Bao Kun. He started shouting, asking Fan Xian about how he dared to ignore him at all. The Fan family did not react again. When they left, people whispered that some of them often witnessed all sorts of various fights. However, it was the first time many of them had seen aristocrats involved in this. As they continued walking, Fan Xian and the others felt other people's eyes on them. The grown-up guys did not react in any way, but Fan Si already blushed with embarrassment and pleasure. One of the people began to talk about how Fan Xian had killed that servant in a purple robe with just one blow. People thought that it was, in that case, and it was not at all surprising that the Fan family held such a high position in the capital. Suddenly, a dark-haired young man in a dark blue robe with white fur on the collar appeared in front of them. This young man turned out to be the son of the prince of Nanking Jin named Lai Hongchen, who turned to Fan Zhuo and said that she was not often seen in the city. Hearing a familiar voice, Fan Zhuo whispered to Fan Xiang that a prince was standing in front of them. Then she was already listening and, with a slight bow, introduced the eldest son of the Prince Jin mansion to her brother. Then she said that their families had been friends for many generations. After that, Fan Zhuo bowed to Lai Hongchen as well, addressing him as His Highness, introducing Fan Xian as the brother the girl had once told him about. Fan Xian looked at him with a calm gaze, slightly expressing discontent and caution. Then His Highness Lai Hongchen reported that he had only briefly heard that there had been some problems here recently. Suddenly, Guo Bao Kun was behind him, who was all annoyed and asked this prince to get justice for them. Hearing Guo Bao Kun's words, His Highness Lai Hongchen turned slightly and looked at the man with the fan. Although he smiled sweetly, however, his smile struck terror and fear into Guo Bao Kun. Prince Lai Hongchen said that at the moment he was communicating with his friends, and he would very much not want anyone to interfere in this friendly conversation. Prince Lai Hongchen smiled even more eerily and terribly, asking Guo Baokun if he understood what His Highness meant. Guo Baokun was covered in cold sweat from terror and fear. After listening to His Highness, the man with the fan ran away. Returning to the conversation with Fan Xiang, His Highness Lai Hongchen said that he did not ask about these maliciously, but only out of pure curiosity. Fan Xian silently listened to what the prince was saying, and then smiled. Chuckling, the dark-haired young man closed his eyes and said that there are scientists, and there are those who only pretend. Laughing slightly, Fan Xian said that he just had his own opinion about the so-called talented scientists. His Highness looked at Fan Xian in bewilderment and asked what exactly the guy meant by that. Fan Xian spread his hands and said that talented scientists used to be called people with outstanding talents. But right now, to carry this title, it was enough just to have connections. After hearing Fan Xian's words, Guo Baokun and He Zhongwei became indignant again. Fan Xian, hearing the indignation of those talented men with fans in their hands nearby, turned to them and smiled broadly, saying that there was too much external gloss and too little intelligence in these scientists. In addition to all this, they obviously will not be of any use to the country. Fan Xian grinned again and said that these talented scientists only had a number of advantages over others. Fan Xian, while he was saying these words, even imagined how the red arrows with his words that these men had too much external gloss and not enough intelligence that they would not be of any use to the country penetrated the bodies of Guo Baokun and He Zhongwei through and through. That they even had red liquid from the mouth from such a poisonous truth. His Highness Lai Hongchen laughed and said that it clearly made sense. These words simply knocked down Mr. He Zhongwei and Mr. Guo Baokun. They collapsed to the floor and were dripping with an imaginary red liquid. Prince Lai Hongchen then said that Fan Xian's train of thought was quite interesting to Lai Hongchen. Then the prince said that Fan Xian should definitely come to him later to discuss it. After finishing the conversation with His Highness Lai Hongchen, the Fan family said goodbye and began to leave the inn. He Zhongwei was waiting for them in the center of the road with a fan in his hands. He stood still and did not express any emotions. Fan Xian stopped in front of everyone, and behind him on the sides were Fan Zhuo and Fan Siyi. He Zhongwei looked at the Fan family and did not move. The fighting kid Fan Siyi could not stand it and began to roll up his sleeves again, shouting questions about what happened and did He Zhongwei decide to fight again. Meanwhile, He Zhongwei was only looking at Fan Xian and wasn't paying attention to anyone else. Fan Xian sternly looked into He Zhongwei's eyes, pulling his dark eyebrows to the bridge of his nose. Then the young gentleman from the Fan family asked He Zhongwei about whether he really had any problems with Fan Xiang. Fan Xian came forward and asked He Zhongwei what he wanted from the young gentleman from the Fan family. Fan Zhuo, at this time, gently stopped Fan Siyi with her hand, who was getting angry again, and was ready to get into a fight again. He Zhongwei continued to stare at the young master in silence. Suddenly, He Zhongwei grabbed his paper fan with both hands and bowed to the young gentleman named Fan Xian, loudly telling him that He Zhongwei dared to be proud of his wealth and power before, but it was Fan Xian who showed him the righteous path. Then He Zhongwei began to cry loudly, shedding tears. His nose was even dripping with snot due to the loud crying. He continued to bow to Fan Xiang and tell him that He Zhongwei, had realized everything. Then a man with a fan in his hand said that he just blindly liked this feeling of power. In addition, the roaring He Zhongwei, continuing to shed his burning tears, said that all these years he could not find the strength to get rid of this temptation. While He Zhongwei bowed and roared for Fan Xian, he looked at the man with the fan in his hands, raising his eyebrows. Fan Zhuo opened her mouth in surprise, and baby Fan Siyi opened it even wider as he was shocked by such a sudden turn of events. Fan Xian, like everyone else, felt very uncomfortable in this situation. Drops of cold sweat even dripped down their faces. Fan Xian was thinking that this guy named He Zhongwei was clearly the theater crying hot tears. Fan Xian then walked past He Zhongwei with all the other juniors. He turned to Zhongwei and said that they all had cowardice in their hearts, calling He Zhongwei a baby under a Confucian robe. A passing Fan Siyi spread his arms to the sides and stuck out his tongue, teasing He Zhongwei. Having almost gone a decent distance, Fan Xian told He Zhongwei that the young man had said a lot of stupid things to him today, so He Zhongwei should not have taken everything so close to his heart. Hearing Fan Xian's words, he stopped crying and froze. Then he turned back in horror and asked what Fan Xian meant when he called He Zhongwei a baby under the Confucian robe. After a certain period of time, the three of them were walking around the shopping district. Fan Xian walked in front of everyone, and Fan Ce and Fan Zhuo stayed close by. Suddenly, Fan Zhuo blushed and giggled. Hearing his younger sister's laughter, Fan Xian turned around in surprise and asked the girl what she remembered so funny. They even stopped because of it. Fan Ce stood and wondered, looking at the giggling elder sister. She couldn't stop laughing that she even covered her mouth with her hands. She then said that it was because just what Fan Xian said earlier was pretty mean, so Fan Zhuo thought it was very funny. She continued to laugh so hard that even tears came to her eyes. Fan Xian looked at his younger sister in surprise and asked her what she was talking about and what Xian had said so funny and mean. Suddenly, Fan Ce raised his little hand up and joyfully reported that he knew, which seemed very funny to his older sister named Fan Zhuo. The kid happily informed the surprised older brother and sister that, apparently, Fan Zhuo laughed for a long time because Fan Xian called He Zhongwei a kid under a Confucian robe. Fan Xian and Fan Zhuo raised their eyebrows and looked strangely at baby Fan Ce, without even expressing a hint of laughter. The latter, drenched in cold sweat, faded away and assumed that he was most likely mistaken. Then Fan Zhuo raised her index finger up and quoted Fan Xian's words, which she liked so much and seemed very funny. She reported that, in fact, she was referring to Fan Xian's phrase that He Zhongwei and Guo Baokun were already skinny. Weren't they afraid that one day they would just be blown away by the wind from their fans? Or it was their way of expressing self-respect. Hearing the repetition of his own words, Fan Xian laughed in embarrassment and scratched his head, saying that he really thought he had overdone it. Then Fan Xian said that he really did not want to destroy Fan Zhuo's opinion of him, which the dark-haired young man had been building for years, immediately upon arrival in the capital. Fan Zhuo folded her hands in front of her and said that after all, these gentlemen with fans in their hands provoked Fan Xian themselves. But his answer was, on top of everything else, very restrained. Then she said that it was Fan Xian, like no one else, who was worthy of being called a talented scientist. Fan Xian shyly waved his head from side to side, saying with a smile that he probably would like to give up such an honorary title. After a while, Fan Xian and Fan Zhuo walked a little ahead. Fan Xian strictly told his younger sister to remember that she shouldn't even think about marrying someone like these guys with paper fans in their hands. Fan Zhuo, not understanding the words of the elder brother, asked him again about what he meant. Fan Ce followed them behind and was silent. When the Fan family reached the horse carriage, they were met by the coachman and invited inside. Fan Zhuo and baby Fan Ce went inside, and then Fan Xian told them to go back alone, while he himself would run through all the shops. Fan Ce looked at his older brother in surprise. A second later, he was already trying to run to Fan Xiang, shouting that he really wanted to stay with his older brother. However, Fan Zhuo grabbed the boy by the collar and told him that the second young master should listen to his elder sister carefully when she said that they were going back to the mansion. After dragging the baby named Fan Ce back inside the carriage, Fan Zhuo told the coachman to drive back to the Fan family mansion. Fan Xian, at this time, followed the wooden cart with his eyes, listening to Fan Ce's screams that he was asking his sister why they should go home and asked to walk down the street again. Then, apparently, Fan Zhuo began to discipline Fan Ce with a long wooden ruler, as Fan Ce's screams that he was in pain reached Fan Xian's ears from the wooden cart. Fan Xian, with his hands folded in front of him, stared sternly at the cart and thought a lot. Fan Xian used to think that Fan Ce had some problems with his older brother. However, there were some discrepancies in this theory. Fan Ce chose the restaurant and the time of their walk together. Remembering this, Fan Xian realized that the brave little Ce was even the first to rush into that fight. The dark-haired young man assumed that all this could be a plan to expose Fan Xian's not the most attractive character traits in front of Prince Jin. In addition, his opinion could well play a role in the continuity of the Fan family's business in the future. But, someone suddenly interrupted Fan Xian's thoughts, saying that he knew what the young master was thinking. This person was Teng Zijing, who, hiding and masking himself strenuously, said that he did not think at all that Fan Ce had anything to do with this. Fan Xian agreed with his words and said that he also believed that Ce was unlikely to be involved in this. Teng Zijing asked the guy in surprise, and then said that he thought that Fan Xian only suspected Fan Zijie. Then Fan Xian chuckled and even smiled warmly, telling Teng Zijing that Fan Zijie often got into trouble as soon as he left the Fan family mansion. So, Fan Xian suggested that according to the lady named Liu Ruyu, it was quite natural that the young gentleman named Fan Xian would have problems if Fan Zijie was by his side all the time. There was no need for any tricks. Suddenly, Fan Xiang had an epiphany that it was quite natural that those with whom the dark-haired young man would face in these disputes would now sharpen a grudge against Fan Xian. Teng Zijing chuckled and said that the plan of the second lady named Liu Ruyu was quite simple, but it was also very effective. However, Fan Xian figured it out too quickly. The young gentleman smiled terribly and said that something was still not clear enough to him yet. Fan Xian also said that Liu Zhuyu thought that against Fan Xian's background, her son would look much more dignified than he actually was. Fan Xian then asked Teng Zijing about what was going on about him. The young man was interested in whether Teng Zijing had come to Danzhou with new evidence in the case. At first, he was silent for a while, and then cleared his throat and said that he had not found any evidence. Fan Xian rolled his eyes, feeling his sense of anger heat up because Teng Zijing didn't bring a single piece of evidence. The three men were banging white clay bowls that were filled with beijiu. Among the trio was His Highness Lai Hongchen, who was drinking in the company of two other men. After drinking beijiu from his bowl, Lai Hongchen reported that they say that the prince was a great connoisseur of literature, but there was not a single genuine talent among his people. A man in a light green robe reported that He Zhongwei was a disciple of Zhang Wenxian. He Zhongwei was a fellow of Jixingyuan University. Then he said that according to forecasts, they said that next year he was supposed to enter the top 3 according to the results of exams. Then a man in a light green robe asked His Highness Lai Hongchen about what he thought about this talented scholar named He Zhongwei. Prince Lai Hongchen chuckled and shook his head, saying that this He Zhongwei was talented, but his character left much to be desired. A man with dark-haired bangs joined the conversation, saying that Guo Baokun was also very bad. He chuckled and said that it was only thanks to the power of his father that Guo Baokun became friends with the prince, which is why he treated the representative of the Fan family with such insane disregard. His Highness Lai Hongchen closed his eyes and said that it would be hard for such mediocre people to survive without power these days. Then the green-eyed Prince Lai Hongchen raised his bowl with beijiu and said that this Fan Xian seemed to him quite an interesting type. The guy in the light green robe began to agree with Lai Hongchen's words, saying that he thought that the news that such an amazing young man appeared in the Fan family would quickly fly around the capital. Suddenly, His Highness Lai Hongchen burst into loud laughter. He, through his loud laughter, told that guy in the green robe not to talk like that, because Lai Hongchen had chosen these two men as his comrades for a reason. In addition, Prince Lai Hongchen, who had already drunk enough, then reported that his father was a prince who did not care about the affairs of the state and considered Lai Hongchen an unworthy son. Then he again began to urge his comrades to quickly drink another bowl of delicious and strong beijiu. At this time, Fan Xian was striking Teng Zijing with his fist. He caught them only with his palm, waiting for the young man to calm down. However, Fan Xian wasn't going to calm down at all. He kept trying to hit Teng Zijing with words about why he came here if he couldn't get any evidence. In addition, Fan Xian believed that the man with the scar on his nose clearly had something to say. Teng Zijing pushed Fan Xian's hand away, and then took off his straw hat. After that, he put his hat on the ground, and he sat on his knees and shyly lowered his head in front of the young gentleman. Fan Xian looked at the man with the scar on his nose in surprise. Teng Zijing, without raising his head, reported that the council had records of everything that was happening. Then he said that if Fan Xian got all these records for Teng Zijing, he promised to devote his whole life to the service of a young gentleman named Fan Xian. Chapter 23. Fan Xian folded his hands in front of him, looking sternly at Teng Zijing sitting on his lap. He asked the man with the scar on his nose that, was he really ready to exchange his whole life for some kind of note? Fan Xian smiled eerily, striking terror into Teng Zijing and said that this deal was even too good. Then he chuckled and pouted, saying that the deal looked too simple. Fan Xian assumed that there must have been some kind of trick in this deal. Teng Zijing looked at Fan Xian in surprise, but then immediately lowered his head, saying that the reason why the man with the scar on his nose got into this department was that he, suffering hardships, helped them. After these words, Teng Zijing told the story that he once taught Guo Baokun a lesson when he saw how this arrogant guy with a fan in his hands mocked others. He hit Guo Baokun for hitting an elderly woman who fell with a basket of carrots on her back. Guo Baokun was badly beaten. His cheek was badly swollen on his face and there was a bright black eye under his eye. After that, the Guo family accused Teng Zijing of murdering an official of the imperial court. With these very words, the Guo family brought trouble to the entire Teng Zijing family. The prosecutor's office saved Teng Zijing and his family. After that, a man with a scar on his nose was forced to work for them. Teng Zijing sank even lower, almost to Fan Xian's feet, informing him that, after the failure of the mission to kill Fan Xian, The man with the scar on his nose returned to the capital. After a while, he found out that his family was missing. Fan Xian, after listening to the man's story, scratched his chin and asked him again about what. Did he really say that? Apparently, the prosecutor's office had done something to Tang Zijing's family. He looked up again and firmly informed that there must have been records about it in that dossier. Tang Zijing then bowed again, first taking out a sharp sword and handing it to the young master. He said that he knew that Fan Xian had a pass, so it shouldn't have been difficult for the young master to get a dossier. Tang Zijing, after these words, promised that if Fan Xian helped him, Tang Zijing's life would belong to the young master. Fan Xian pouted thoughtfully, looking at the man with the scar on his nose who bowed to him. Then the dark-haired young man lowered himself to the man and touched his biceps. The latter looked at Fan Xian in surprise. The young man sitting in front of him smiled brightly, exposing his snow-white teeth, and said that he agreed with the deal, so he would arrange everything. After a certain period of time, Fan Xian found himself at a 3-story building made of dark wood. It was the prosecutor's office building. Fan Xian sternly looked up and thought a lot about the fact that these prosecutors allegedly saved Tang Zijing's family, but in fact they decided to just use it as leverage on the man. In addition, the murder of the official, too, could well have been the work of the prosecutor's office, and not Guo Baokun's family. Having finished with his thoughts, Fan Xian smiled slyly and said that now, right now, he would be able to find out everything himself. Then the young gentleman went inside. The first floor was, apparently, a dungeon. It was very dark inside the building. Only the weak light of torches illuminated the way through the prosecutor's office building. The young man heard some voices asking about something and told him to continue. Fan Xian then walked past 2 strange and discontented men who were eyeing him with a creepy look. After some time, Fan Xian came in and saw a crowd of men in black, apparently, who were employees of the prosecutor's office. They were cleaning up some kind of corpse, the sheet on which was soaked with a red liquid. The other 2 men were dragging another man unconscious and covered in blood. Another man was holding a white cloth bundle, which was also stained with red liquid. There was a sharp smell of iron in the room. However, what was most suspicious was that everyone was looking closely at Fan Xian. The young gentleman frowned at the bridge of his nose and tensed. He was thinking that the fact that everyone was looking at him like that was clearly not a good sign. Fan Xian then approached the man in the green robe and politely asked about why they were all staring at Fan Xian instead of going about their important business. A dark-haired man in a green robe looked at Fan Xian with a creepy smile and asked him that if the guy himself had caught a stranger where no one was allowed to enter, did Fan Xian really think that no one would have stared at him? After these words, the wide smile of this man began to frighten even more. Fan Xian frowned in bewilderment, trying not to look at the creepy smiling man, and asked about what, wasn't it a government agency? Then the young gentleman answered his own question, saying that this institution was a government one. After that, Fan Xian asked this man with a creepy smile, dressed in green clothes, that, wasn't it natural that from time to time, strangers who had nothing to do with this place before would definitely appear here anyway? The man in the green robe laughed loudly and covered his mouth with his hand, asking Fan Xian about strangers. Then he smiled broadly again and, removing his hand from his face, said that why would strangers be here, because everything was measured here. Then, continuing to smile broadly, he folded his hands in front of him and then stretched out one of them, gesturing. Then this man again smiled terribly and asked Xian that, would there be at least one person among the residents of the capital who would come here, to their prosecutor's office, of their own free will? Fan Xian's eyes bulged in horror and his mouth opened slightly. His body began to break out in a cold sweat, and large drops flowed down his face, cooling the young man's face. The guy's whole body was shaking violently. Fan Xian looked at the dark-haired man in the green robe in horror and said that he thought that what this creepy smiling man said sounded pretty logical. Then the young gentleman named Fan Xian gathered his thoughts and took out of his dark clothes a brown badge that his teacher named Fei Jai had once given him. He believed the man in the green robe that everything was fine, since Fan Xian came to the prosecutor's office building solely on business. Imitating an uncertain cough into his hand, Fan Xian, holding a brown badge with golden hieroglyphs in his other hand, said that he was here for the first time, so he still did not know all the subtleties. A creepy smiling man in a green robe, seeing the badge in Xian's hands, turned cold at the moment and was covered with cold sweat. Large drops of sweat were running down his face, and that creepy smile became nervous and not at all terrifying. He hesitantly folded his hands in front of him and asked if Fan Xian really had a pass token in his hands. Then he asked to be allowed to ask the dark-haired young man about who he was at all. Fan Xian leveled up and, slightly raising his eyebrows and closing his eyes, announced that he was a disciple of Fei Jai. When the young man opened his eyes, the man next to him disappeared. Fan Xian yelled in horror. Then he heard the voice of this man who was standing at a distance behind the guy in this room. The man bowed, since the guy turned out to be a disciple of Fei Jai. Drops of cold sweat trickled down Fan Xian's face due to fright. He, slightly horrified, asked the man in the green robe about why he stood so far away from the young gentleman. The man in the green robe bowed even lower, blushing with fear. Cold sweat broke out on his face again. Then he said that he subconsciously associated Mr. Fei Jai with such very dangerous substances as various poisons. So, as this man in green clothes believed, it was quite a logical reaction. Fan Xian quickly walked closer to the man and asked him if he could show the young man the way. In a bow, the man said that Fan Xian did not come at the right time, since Mr. Fei Jai was not in place. When Fan Xian came closer, he slowly retreated back. The man in the green robe bowed even lower, pointing his hand to the side, while informing the young gentleman that Mr. Fei Jai had gone to the border to check something. Fan Xian wanted to ask something else, but the man, running away very quickly, said only after that, if that was all, then he would go. However, suddenly, a young gentleman named Fan Xian caught up with this green-robed man and told him to stand still. He froze in horror and opened his mouth, pouring streams of cold sweat. Fan Xian, on the other hand, put his hand on the shoulder of this man, who was already trembling in horror, and, smiling terribly, said that there was one more thing that this man could help Fan Xian with. After a certain period of time, they ended up in the archive of the prosecutor's office. Unlike the creepy dark dungeon, the archive was much lighter and did not instill a nightmare in Fan Xian. A lot of wooden shelves with various books and documentation scrolls were stored here in the archive. The man in the green robe was walking slowly through the archive in search of number 543. She repeated this number several times while looking for the necessary documents. And Fan Xian, at this time, was also slowly following him. This man began to smile again when he said that these were simple documents that were not confidential at all. Fan Xian, listening to this man in green clothes, at this time, was looking at a large light archive with his mouth wide open. So many different documents were stored here for many years, and it amazed the guy. Tens of thousands of scrolls that were, on top of everything else. They were sorted by their serial and serial numbers. After finding some papers, apparently numbered 543, the man in the green robe asked Fan Xian that, if he remembered correctly, this young gentleman from the Fan family needed information about a man named Teng Zijing. He agreed and noticed that the man had an unusually good memory. Then this man in green clothes, with a wide smile on his face, asked if he could ask about the reason why Fan Xian needed this document. The young dark-haired gentleman approached the man with a bored face, and when he was very close, he smiled again terribly and raised his eyebrows, saying that he, of course, could have asked about it, since Fan Xian killed this guy. The man froze in horror, looking at Fan Xian. Cold sweat broke out on his face again, and a terrible shiver ran through his body. Then the man in the green robe turned away from Fan Xian and, again pulling a smile on his face, informed the young gentleman named Fan Xian that there were many volumes in this document, so it would take some time to find them all. Fan Xian, at this time, was smiling slyly, looking at the rack of documents. Then the excited man suggested to Fan Xian that maybe if the young master would let him, the man would find them and personally deliver them to the young master from the Fan family tomorrow directly home to the Fan residence. He asked Fan Xian, trembling slightly, what he thought about this idea. Fan Xian, at this time, fell silent, pondering the words of the man in green robes. There were tens of thousands of scrolls in the archive of the prosecutor's office. In addition, the man in green clothes remembered the serial number of Teng Zijing's case. However, for some reason he could not find it. Fan Xian smiled slyly and thought that he was an official, so the guy decided that he had to outwit this smiling man. Fan Xian spread his hands to the sides and pouted his lips, agreeing to this idea. Then the young gentleman said that he thought that the man was just afraid to take responsibility. Fan Xian said he would report it. Then he turned to the exit and waved goodbye to the man in green clothes, finally saying that he would not forget to bring all these documents to the young man tomorrow. Then suddenly Fan Xian stopped and asked the excited man in the green robe about his name. He bowed, clasping his palms in front of him and, with a smile, informed Mr. Fan that his name was Wang Kai Nian. Chapter 24. After a while, Fan Xian came out of the dark wooden building of the prosecutor's office, thinking that teacher Fei Jai was not in the capital. The young master slyly raised his eyebrows, even slightly lasciviously, and scratched his chin, thinking that he had thought earlier to ask his teacher named Fei Jai to help the young master. And then the guy, blushing slightly, thought that he should have made an appointment with his fiancée Miss Lin earlier. Fan Xian would like to meet his fiancée early in order to learn about her family's other illnesses. However, he understood that now he could only wait. Still standing near the dark wooden gate of the prosecutor's office building, Fan Xian stretched, thinking that there really were a lot of people in the capital, in the prosecutor's office building. The young gentleman believed that it was not surprising that ordinary civilians avoided this terrible place. Fan Xian walked relaxed for a while with his hands behind his back. Then he saw something depicted on a stone slab and stopped. After looking closely, the guy's eyes bulged in surprise. The name Yi Qingmei was carved on the concrete slab. Fan Xian, even with his mouth slightly open, froze and stopped, cold and sweating from the realization that his mother's name was really carved on the steel. Fan Xian stopped and began to carefully examine the concrete steel, thinking that there could be something else on it. The young gentleman folded his hands in front of him, carefully examining the inscriptions carved on the steel. To himself, the guy thought that despite the fact that at that time Mrs. Yi's family was one of the richest, however, it was this Lady Yi who failed to enjoy these riches. Fan Xian, walking at a walking pace, thought about what Uncle Wu Zhu once told the young man that 10 years ago, all the enemies of the Yi family were killed in the turmoil, but the name Yi Qingmei was still considered taboo. A dark-haired young man walked along a road made of light paving stones, thoughtfully rubbing his chin. Fan Xian thought that his mother's strange death, after all, must have had something to do with the prince's entourage. Fan Xian pulled his dark eyebrows to the bridge of his nose, thoughtfully examining the road of light paving stones. The young man reflected on the fact that these confidants of the prince so openly even engraved her name on a stone stele. It seemed to Fan Xian even too bold an act. Suddenly, Fan Xian froze and stopped, thinking that, apparently, he was suspended and thoughts left the young master's head. The young man came across some dark building, however, he did not understand at all where he was. The young gentleman decided to go inside and ask there about how he could get back to the Fan family's house. The young man opened the heavy metal doors and looked inside. He was immediately greeted by a dark-haired, middle-aged man in a blue robe. This man was the caretaker of the temple who had told Fan Xian to stop a few moments ago. This man, who was the caretaker of the temple, leveled off and told Fan Xian to leave, since mass was currently going on in the temple, and Fan Xian was disturbing people. The young man went inside and pouted his lips, telling this caretaker that he just wanted to ask for directions. Then Fan Xian, looking at this tall man in a blue robe, said that he was very upset by such an aggressive attitude of this caretaker of the temple. The young gentleman, looking irritably at this caretaker, walked forward, along the way informing the man that now he really wanted to see what was there. Suddenly, the caretaker of the temple concentrated his bright red Kai energy in his big hand and, with cries of death wish to the young master from the Fan family, grabbed him by the shoulder. Fan Xian, looking terribly at the man's hand, slapped him sharply, splashing his bright yellow Kai energy that it even collapsed between them with a small explosion. The caretaker of the temple knitted his eyebrows to the bridge of his nose and attacked the young man again with his palms filled with bright red Kai energy. However, now Fan Xian, concentrating bright blue Kai energy in his fists, attacked the caretaker of the temple. They collided, putting their palm and fist together and splashing huge bright streams of red and blue Kai energy in all directions. The leaves falling from the trees, from such a powerful flow of mixed Kai energy, instantly withered and turned into ashes. A middle-aged man, who was the caretaker of the temple, pushed Fan Xian out of this temple with a bullet. The young man stopped on a road made of light paving stones. Behind him, a stern man in a blue robe walked out with a calm step. He pulled his eyebrows to the bridge of his nose and tensed so that even the veins bulged on this man's forehead. He looked at Fan Xian with complete seriousness. He was amazed by such serious strength at such a young age. Then the caretaker of the temple asked the child named Fan Xian about which family he belonged to. The latter, all bruised and disheveled, pulled his dark eyebrows to the bridge of his nose and sternly looked at the man in the blue robe, asking him about what he cared about it at all. Then the dark-haired guy said that, by the way, according to the laws of the Qing dynasty, everyone had the right to pray in the temple. The young man was very much interested in the reason why this caretaker in a blue robe was stopping him. So also by such methods, the creepy blue-robed man who was the caretaker of the temple lowered his gaze, making it even more intimidating. Then he took hold of the black gate doors and began to close them slowly, informing Fan Xian that there were nobles in the temple at the moment, so only when they left, Fan Xian would be able to go inside to kneel and pray. Then the caretaker of the temple slammed the heavy doors with a bang, leaving Fan Xian outside. He stood for a while, completely motionless, and looked at these dark, almost black gates. Suddenly, the dark-haired young man shuddered and was covered with cold sweat, feeling something begin to roll up to his throat. Also, suddenly, the guy bent slightly, holding his stomach with his hands, and then he vomited a bright red liquid. After spitting out all the contents, Fan Xian leveled up again and began to wipe the bright red droplets from his mouth with his hand. At this time, he was looking at this dark heavy gate and thinking a lot. He considered himself lucky that the young master managed to press the opponent's acupuncture point during the attack. Otherwise, the guy was very afraid that the consequences would be much more serious. Also, the dark-haired young man thought that some very important person must be praying in the temple at the moment. Fan Xian turned around to go back already. While he was picking his little finger in his ear, the young man was thinking that he obviously could not defeat that man, the caretaker of the temple. In that case, Fan Xian decided that he wouldn't even ask for trouble anymore and would just ask for directions to the Fan family mansion elsewhere. Suddenly, this creepy man, who was the caretaker of the temple, opened the dark heavy gate and announced that his master had ordered Fan Xian to go to the side hall for prayer, bypassing the main hall. Fan Xian, at this time, froze in shock and even stuck his little finger out of his ear. He raised his eyebrows up and bulged his eyes, continuing to listen to this blue-robed temple caretaker. Then the young man turned around and looked at this fickle middle-aged man in surprise. Then Fan Xian began to slowly enter the temple grounds, lamenting at the same time that the caretaker of the temple was too fickle a man. Then it was impossible to enter, and now suddenly it became possible. He did not respond to the young man's indignation, but only reminded him that Fan Xian should not have entered the main hall in any case. He waved his hand and showed his little finger to the man in the blue robe, telling him that he would not go to the main hall, and he understood everything. At this time, a man in a white robe was standing in the center of the main hall. To his left stood a gilded figure of some mythical creature. The walls of the main hall were decorated with beautiful bright red and yellow frescoes with an unusual pattern. There was a heavy smell of burning incense in the main hall. After some time, a tall man in a blue robe, who was the caretaker of the temple, went inside the main hall and, bowing to the man in a white robe, reported that, as he ordered, the caretaker of the temple allowed Fan Xian inside. The man in the white robe said that he was very curious about what kind of young man could withstand the attack of the man in the blue robe. He lowered his head and smiled slightly, saying that the strength of this young gentleman was really incredible. The man in the white robe, continuing to look at the patterned bright-colored mural, asked in surprise about Fan Xian's incredible strength. Then he chuckled and said a little joyfully that it was very good that there were still real talents in the country, like a man like Fan Xian. After some time, Fan Xian came to the side hall. Unlike the main hall, this hall was very small. The thick smell of burning incense was not so sharp. A bright-colored mural, similar to the one in the main hall, was painted only in the center of the wall. After looking around the side prayer hall, Fan Xian sat down on a soft ottoman and folded his hands in front of him. Then a young gentleman named Fan Xian closed his eyes and turned to God with a request to allow the young man to live his life in peace and tranquility. However, the dark-haired guy also noticed that he obviously wouldn't refuse money and women either. Suddenly, from the table where the offerings for the gods were lying, one of the apples that had been lying quietly on a white clay plate fell to the floor. Fan Xian shuddered and abruptly got up from the ottoman, interrupting his prayer due to severe fright. The guy looked at the table in horror, hearing some strange sound. Fan Xian did not understand at all where this sound came from. He was also worried about the question of whether Fan Xian's prayer had really attracted the attention of heaven. Recognizing that the sound was coming from under the table, Fan Xian bent down and took out his sharpened, sharp metal dagger, preparing for an attack. The dark-haired guy moved closer to the table and examined it carefully, thinking that someone was clearly hiding under it. Fan Xian firmly took the beige tablecloth in his hand and abruptly lifted it up to look at who decided to play a ghost there. Seeing the man sitting under the table, the dark-haired guy first frowned to the bridge of his nose, and then suddenly raised his eyes up and bulged, frozen in surprise. In front of him, a blonde girl was sitting under the table, eating a fried chicken leg. When she saw Fan Xian, she started in surprise and looked at him in surprise.